On the day of my surgery, my wife, who's going to accompany me, left before it even started. Chapter 1. It was nearly 11 in the evening when Eamon heard the faint scrape of a key turning in the front door lock. He sat on the edge of their living room sofa, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, staring at the shadowed floor. The quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway kept him company in her absence. Every second passed like a small weight, dropped one after another into his chest. Celine stepped inside, the muted click of her heels against the hardwood floor breaking the heavy silence. She set her bag down by the door with a sharp exhale, her face tired, framed by loose strands of hair escaping from the bun at the nape of her neck. She didn't look at him right away. "You're still up," she said, more of a statement than a question. Her tone was clipped, but not cold, just weary. "I was waiting for you," Eamon replied quietly. Celine gave a soft, impatient sigh and walked past him toward the kitchen. "You didn't have to," she said, grabbing a glass from the cupboard and filling it with water. "I told you I'd be late. You've been late a lot." His voice was calm, but there was something under it, something that made her shoulders stiffen for a fraction of a second. She drank, then set the glass down harder than necessary. "Eamon, not tonight," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "I need to talk to you," he said. "It's important." Finally, Celine turned around and really looked at him. The room dimmed slightly as she walked back into the living room, standing at first, as if unsure whether to stay. She caught the look in his eyes, something different, and reluctantly sat down across from him. Her expression softened, just a little. "What is it?" Eamon took a moment, drawing in a slow breath as if to steady the words inside him. "I went to the hospital today," he started. "I've been feeling off for a while now. Tightness in my chest, shortness of breath. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I thought I should check." Celine's brows knitted, her gaze searching his face for clues she might have missed all this time. "And?" she asked carefully. "They found something," Eamon said. "A tumor. Benign. It's not cancer, but they said it's pressing against my lung." His voice faltered for a second. "I need surgery." Celine stared at him, her eyes widening slightly, blinking as if trying to process the words. Then she reached out, resting her hand over his. Her fingers were cold. "Eamon, I'm so sorry," she said softly, her face folding into something almost tender. For a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. Then she pulled her hand back and straightened, something shifting behind her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her tone unexpectedly sharper now. "If it's curable, then just have the surgery." Eamon blinked at her, thrown. "Because I wanted you to know," he said. "Because it's not just my life. We're supposed to be partners, Celine." She shook her head faintly, lips pressed together. "You didn't have to tell me to get my permission," she said. "You're capable of making decisions." "I didn't say I needed permission," Eamon replied, trying to stay calm. "I wanted to talk to you about it. The surgery isn't cheap. I can afford it, but it'll set us back. And I thought we should." Celine cut him off. "We make enough," she said quickly. "You make enough. Do it. What else is there to talk about?" He looked at her closely now, noticing the way she wouldn't quite meet his gaze, the way her hands fidgeted, tracing invisible lines on the couch cushion. "There's a lot to talk about," he said slowly. "But it's hard when you're barely here." Celine stood up abruptly, crossing her arms. "Don't do this now, Eamon." "When then?" His voice was quiet, but there was something heavy in it. "When do we talk about how distant you've been? About how we've been together for 7 years, and I barely recognize us anymore." She flinched, turning away for a moment before whispering, "I'm tired. I'm working hard for us." "Are you?" he asked gently. "Because I don't know if there's still an us to." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "I'll schedule the surgery," Eamon said after a while. "But I need you to be there." Celine stood frozen for a moment, and when she finally turned to him, her expression was unreadable. "Of course I'll be there," she said. but her voice lacked conviction. He wanted to believe her. He really did. The next morning, Eamon woke early, long before the sun pulled itself over the horizon. Sleep had come in short fits, his mind still tangled in everything from the night before. But when the first light crept between the curtains, he found himself strangely calm, determined even. After a quick breakfast of toast and coffee he barely tasted, Eamon grabbed his coat and left their apartment, heading to the hospital. Since Celine has always been the earliest person to leave, this routine became very common for him. The hospital lobby was quiet that early in the morning, save for the occasional shuffle of shoes and murmurs from the reception desk. He sat there for a while, waiting for his name to be called, hands clenched loosely in his lap. Every time the door opened, he glanced up, half expecting something, or someone he couldn't quite name. When Dr. Velasquez finally ushered him in, the room was still and sterile, the faint scent of antiseptic floating in the air. "You're lucky, Mr. Varelli," the doctor said, sliding the folder open. "The tumor hasn't changed its size since the last time we met. It's still benign and localized. And yesterday I wasn't able to see you due to other things I have to attend to. But it's good you came in when you did. We can schedule surgery as soon as after tomorrow. You'll need to rest tomorrow and make sure someone's with you after the operation." Eamon nodded slowly, absorbing the timeline. After tomorrow, right? He hesitated. "And the surgery itself? It's safe?" Dr. Velasquez gave him a reassuring look. "Routine in your case. You'll be in good hands." Eamon left the hospital feeling lighter, though a quiet nervousness still prickled beneath his skin. As he stood at the curb pulling his keys and entering his car, he sat down and pulled out his phone and typed a message to Celine. "Eamon, the surgery's scheduled for Sunday, day after tomorrow. They said I'll need someone with me. It's your day off. Are you free?" He stared at the message for a few seconds before hitting send. He pocketed the phone and started his car. Halfway on the road, his phone buzzed softly in his coat pocket. "Celine." "Yes, I'll be there." A simple message. But to Eamon, it was like a window opening, letting in air he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. For the first time in weeks, maybe longer, he allowed a small smile to settle on his lips. Maybe this was it. Maybe they still had time, still had a chance to find their way back to each other. That night, Eamon made dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just pasta with roasted vegetables, garlic bread from the freezer, and a small bottle of red wine he found tucked away behind the dishes in the cupboard. He ate alone, but he saved a plate for Celine, covering it carefully and setting it in the oven to stay warm. He left the TV on, scrolling absently through channels he didn't really watch. His mind wandered, imagining the two of them sitting together at the kitchen table again, like they used to, laughing over small things, planning trips they never got around to taking. By 11, he found himself drifting on the couch, the faint flicker of light from the television washing his face in soft blue. He told himself he'd wait up, but eventually, the weight of the day pressed him into sleep. The sound of the lock turning jolted him awake, just a little. He blinked groggily at the glow of the TV, then toward the door. It was past midnight when Celine came in. She stepped inside quietly, closing the door with a soft click. The apartment was dim, except for the faint light from the television and the warm glow from the stove clock. She set her bag down carefully this time, as if not to wake him, but she stood there for a moment, watching him sleep. Eamon was half-curled on the couch, one arm under his head, his breathing slow and even. He looked peaceful like this, younger even. The lines of worry that had dug themselves into his face over the last year seemed gentler in sleep. Celine exhaled, barely a sound, and moved toward him. She reached down, hesitating as her fingers hovered near his face. For a second, it looked like she might touch him. But instead, she tugged the throw blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over him carefully. As she straightened up, the light from the TV flickered across her face. There was something distant in her eyes, tired but thoughtful. She stood there for another long moment, watching him, before quietly walking toward their bedroom. She paused by the hallway, glancing back at him one more time. Eamon stirred slightly under the blanket but didn't wake. His face relaxed again. Celine disappeared down the hall, and the apartment was quiet once more. Sunday came, gray and overcast, the sky hanging low as if heavy with something unspoken. Eamon stood by the front door, wearing a simple button-down shirt and dark slacks. He held his overnight bag loosely in one hand, waiting as Celine grabbed her keys from the counter. She was dressed in tailored black pants and a cream blouse, almost as if she were going to work instead of accompanying her husband for surgery. But he didn't comment. Instead, he smiled faintly when she opened the door for him and followed her to the car. They hadn't driven anywhere together in months. Years, it felt like. Eamon watched her hands on the wheel as they pulled out of the parking garage, the way her fingers flexed. Her wedding band gleamed faintly when it caught the pale light. He looked out the window, watching the city pass by, and for a brief moment, he let himself imagine that this was just an ordinary day, that they were heading out for coffee or a late brunch. He felt lighter than he had in a long time, just like they used to enjoy having road trips in their earlier marriage. And when Celine asked if he was comfortable, he nodded. "I'm glad you're here," he said softly. Celine glanced at him but didn't answer. They reached a red light, the car rolling to a smooth stop. The city sounds buzzed faintly around them, tires hissing on damp asphalt. That was when Celine's phone vibrated sharply in the console between them. She stared at it for a few seconds longer than necessary. The name on the screen wasn't visible to Eamon, but he noticed the way her jaw tightened. Celine picked up her Bluetooth earpiece, fitting it in place. She tapped it on. "Hello." There was silence in the car for a few beats, the voice on the other end faint enough that Eamon couldn't make out the words, only the urgent, clipped tone of whoever it was. He turned his gaze toward the windshield, his hands tightening in his lap, listening without meaning to. "I'm not available right now," Celine said. Her voice was smooth but strained. "I'm heading to the hospital." Another pause. The voice on the other end grew sharper, insistently cutting through the static and faint city noise. "I told you, I can't." Celine's tone faltered, just for a second. Then she sighed, an exhale that sounded like it came from deep exhaustion. "Fine," she whispered. "I'll try." Eamon caught that part. He turned his head toward her. "Everything okay?" he asked carefully. Celine didn't answer. She tapped her earpiece again, cutting the call as the light turned green. The car surged forward, her hands a little tighter on the wheel than before. They pulled into the hospital parking lot 15 minutes later. Celine killed the engine, sitting there for a few moments without moving. "I need to go somewhere," she said suddenly. Eamon blinked. "What?" Her gaze stayed forward, fixed on the hospital's sliding glass doors. "It's urgent," she said. For a second, neither of them spoke. Eamon's mind struggled to make sense of what she was saying, but when he finally spoke, his voice cracked faintly. "Is it more urgent than me?" Celine finally turned to look at him, and for the first time in a long time, he could see something behind her carefully controlled expression. Guilt, uncertainty, maybe even regret. But she didn't answer the question. "I'll be back before your surgery is over," she said instead. She got out of the car quickly, grabbing his bag from the back seat and walking beside him through the entrance. They checked in at reception, and a nurse came to assist. Celine handed over Eamon's paperwork and bag to the nurse, giving instructions with practiced efficiency. "I'll be back," she said again, almost like a promise, but hollow, like words she wasn't sure she could keep. And then she turned away. Eamon watched her walk down the hall, each step taking her farther from him. There was no glance back, no wave. He stood there, the world narrowing around him until all he could hear was the thud of his heartbeat in his ears. A sharp, hot pressure grew in his chest, like something was pushing outward from the inside. He clutched at his sternum suddenly, fingers curling into his shirt. The nurse, a woman in light blue scrubs with dark, worried eyes, caught the movement instantly and rushed to his side. "Mr. Varelli? Sir, are you okay? You need to sit down." He shook his head. His breathing quickened. It's..." His words came out broken, thin. His knees buckled slightly, and the nurse grabbed his arm, easing him down into the nearest chair. "Deep breaths," she urged. "Try to stay calm. Just breathe." But Eamon couldn't. The pain flared hot and sharp across his chest, a crushing weight that blurred his vision. His heart pounded wildly, as though it might burst. His skin went pale, then gray. Cold sweat slicked his brow. "Nurse, I need help," she shouted to a passing orderly. Within seconds, a gurney was wheeled in, and Eamon was lifted onto it. His body convulsed faintly, his hand still clutching at his chest. Doctors and nurses swarmed him as alarms blared faintly in the distance. "He's crashing. Get me vitals, now. BP's dropping fast. He's in cardiac arrest. Code blue. We need to intubate." They raced him toward the emergency operating room, working desperately. The benign tumor, which they had planned to remove with a simple routine surgery, had rapidly changed. His body was in systemic shock. His vitals plummeted as the tumor spread aggressively, almost impossibly fast. It was no longer just a mass in his chest. It had metastasized within minutes, his lungs, his heart, even his bloodstream. Inside the ER, the lead surgeon stared at the scans, his face pale. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. "It wasn't malignant. How the hell?" No one had answers. They worked as fast as they could, but it was too late. His heart gave out, and there was no bringing him back. At 2:47 p.m., Eamon Varelli was pronounced dead. The room went silent but for the beeping of machines winding down. The doctor stood there, stunned, looking at the chart. One of the younger nurses stepped back, her hand trembling as she pulled the sheet over Eamon's still face. They had never seen anything like it. A benign tumor turned killer in a heartbeat. And Celine wasn't there. The room was silent except for the faint hum of machines shutting down. Dr. Velasquez pulled off his gloves with a weary, almost mechanical motion. He let out a long breath, his face grim, as he glanced at the monitor one last time, confirming what they already knew. "Call it," he said quietly. "Time of death, 2:47 p.m., echoed a nurse, recording the final entry. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dr. Velasquez turned to the assisting nurse, Maria, the one who had been with Eamon from the start. "Maria, contact the patient's family," he said. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it. "His wife was supposed to be here, wasn't she?" Maria hesitated. Her lips parted as she glanced down at Eamon, covered now by a thin white sheet, then back at the doctor. "She left," Maria admitted. "She brought him in, but before we could prep him for surgery, she said she had something urgent and handed me his belongings." She shook her head slowly, an ache forming behind her eyes. He looked hurt, not physically, like something broke inside him when she walked away. 5 minutes later, he started to clutch his chest. It all happened so fast. Dr. Velasquez stared at her for a moment, processing. His jaw tightened. "I want her found," he said firmly. "Now." Maria nodded, moving swiftly to the nurse's station. She flipped through Eamon's file, locating Celine Varelli's contact number. With shaking fingers, she dialed. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then Celine answered. "Hello." Her voice was clipped, distracted. There was faint noise in the background, somewhere public. A crowd? Music? It was hard to tell. "Mrs. Varelli," Maria said carefully, steadying her voice. "This is Nurse Maria Valdez from St. Herodin's. I need you to come back to the hospital immediately." A pause on the other end. "Why?" Celine asked after a second, guarded. "It's regarding your husband. Please, come as soon as you can." She didn't wait for more. Celine hung up, not asking anything further. About 30 minutes later, the hospital doors slid open and Celine entered, walking fast. Her heels echoed in the corridor, sharp and decisive. She looked composed on the surface, but her eyes were wide, flickering with something close to panic. Maria spotted her first. "Mrs. Varelli," she called gently. Celine's gaze snapped toward her. She strode over. "Where is Eamon?" she asked immediately. Her voice was tight but controlled. Maria hesitated. Please come this way, she said instead, leading her to an empty consultation room. Celine followed, her steps slowing as they crossed the threshold. Inside, Dr. Velasquez was waiting, his hands folded together, standing by the small table in the middle of the room. He turned as they entered, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Varelli, he greeted, his tone measured. What's going on? She asked. She was trying to keep her voice level, but there was a tremor beneath it now. Where's my husband? Dr. Velasquez took a breath. Please sit down. I'm fine standing. Celine shot back, crossing her arms tightly. The doctor exchanged a brief look with Maria before he spoke again. I'm sorry, he said, each word heavy. Your husband passed away this afternoon. The words hung in the air for a moment, surreal and impossible. Celine didn't move. What? She said, like she hadn't heard him right. He went into cardiac arrest. We did everything we could. But Velasquez shook his head slightly. It happened very suddenly. His tumor, what we diagnosed as benign, became highly aggressive in a matter of minutes. We've never seen anything like it. Celine stared at him, her arms slowly falling to her sides. No, that's not possible. Her voice cracked on the last word. I know this is difficult to process, Dr. Velasquez continued, his voice softening. But I need to ask, where did you go, Mrs. Varelli? You were here, and then you left. Celine looked at him sharply. That's none of your business. Maria's expression tightened, but she stayed silent. Mrs. Varelli, Dr. Velasquez pressed gently. We're trying to understand. Though it's not my business to ask further, but he was stable. Then you left, and 5 minutes later he was gone. There was a deep silence. Celine's hands were trembling now, barely noticeable but there. I had to leave, she said quietly. I had an urgent meeting. With who? Dr. Velasquez asked carefully. Celine's mouth opened, then closed. She took a breath, but it was shallow. I said it's none of your business. Dr. Velasquez studied her for a long moment. There was something in her eyes that told him more than her words did. I'm sorry for your loss, he said at last, his tone more distant now. We'll need you to sign some paperwork and arrange for his transfer. Celine nodded stiffly. Her face was pale. She stood there, still as stone, as if waiting to wake up from something. Then she turned without another word and walked out of the consultation room, her heels once again sharp against the tile floor. Maria watched her go, her heart heavy. Do you think she knew? She asked the doctor quietly. Velasquez exhaled through his nose, folding his arms. I think, he said slowly, there's more going on here than we understand. Chapter 2. Celine followed the nurse silently through the sterile white corridors, her heels muffled now against the cold linoleum. Every step echoed faintly in her head, but she barely registered it. Her breath was shallow, her fingers twitching at her sides. She felt hollow, detached, as if none of this was real. They reached the morgue, a heavy metal door that slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, the air was colder, sharper. The lights were dimmed, washing everything in sterile blue-gray tones. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else, something metallic beneath it. The nurse paused by one of the gurneys and gestured gently. He's here, she said softly, her voice respectful but distant, as if used to this kind of grief. Celine took a slow step forward, and then another. Eamon lay there, his body still beneath the white sheet that covered him from the chest down. His face was turned slightly toward her, peaceful in a way that made her stomach twist, like he was sleeping, like he might wake up if she just whispered his name. Her throat burned as she reached out with both hands, fingers trembling. She gripped the edge of the sheet and slowly, carefully, pulled it back. His face was pale, still, but there was no pain in his features anymore. No lines of worry or exhaustion, only quiet. Celine's breath hitched sharply, and before she could stop herself, tears welled hot and fast, sliding down her cheeks. She pressed a hand against her mouth to stifle the broken sob that escaped. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her fingers. Her voice cracked on the word. I shouldn't have left you." Her hand trembled as she lowered it to his cheek, brushing lightly against his cold skin. The contrast of his cool flesh against her warm fingertips made her wince, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she traced the familiar line of his jaw, her fingers lingering there like they used to when he fell asleep on the couch after a long day. "I should have stayed," she choked out. I thought I had more time." Her shoulders shook as she bowed her head, resting her forehead lightly against his. "You waited for me. You always waited. And I never." Her breath hitched again, breaking into a ragged sob that echoed faintly in the cold room. The nurse stood quietly nearby, giving her space, but after several minutes, she stepped closer. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Varelli, I'm so sorry, but we'll need you to finish the release forms when you're ready." Celine's hand lingered on Eamon's cheek for a moment longer before she nodded slowly. She smoothed his hair back. He always liked it neat, and let her fingers drift down to squeeze his shoulder, as if saying goodbye. Then she straightened, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, though the tears still came. She pulled the sheet back over his face, slowly, gently, her hand lingering one last time before she stepped away. The nurse opened the door for her, and Celine stepped back into the brighter hallways, blinking against the sharp light. But everything felt dim, faded. She followed the nurse in silence to the reception desk where the necessary paperwork waited. Cold, clinical, full of checkboxes and signatures that reduced his entire life to dates and cause of death. As she took the pen in hand, her fingers hovered for a moment, as if they might refuse to move. And then she wrote, her signature scrawled shakily on the line. Afterward, she sat back in the chair, staring at nothing for a long time. "I'll be back," she murmured to herself, so quiet the nurse barely heard. She wasn't sure who she was promising, herself or Eamon. Celine stood in silence as the funeral service attendants gently loaded Eamon's body into the sleek, black hearse. The gleaming vehicle reflected the gray, overcast sky, and for a moment, she saw herself mirrored there, small, pale, hollow-eyed. She inhaled shakily as the back door was closed with a heavy finality. The driver gave her a polite nod before climbing into the front seat. Celine followed in her own car, keeping close behind. The ride was slow, almost solemn in pace, and as they moved through familiar streets, memories flickered behind her eyes. Eamon driving them to late-night dinners. Eamon laughing at something silly she said, his hand resting over hers on the gearshift. Her chest tightened, but she pressed her lips together, holding herself steady. By the time they arrived at Valemont Memorial Chapel, a place Eamon had mentioned once for its quiet and simplicity, Celine was calmer. Her breathing was even. Her hands no longer shook. She focused on the tasks ahead. The details, the logistics. It was easier that way. Inside, she arranged everything with the funeral director. Flowers, music, seating. She chose a modest casket, deep mahogany, with simple silver handles. Nothing ostentatious. Eamon had always hated extravagance. She signed the final paperwork swiftly, her pen gliding with precision over forms that spelled out his final arrangements. Afterward, Celine sat in one of the small offices, her phone in hand. She took a breath and began making calls. Her voice was quiet but steady as she told them. "Eamon is gone. He passed away yesterday. The memorial will be at Valemont Memorial Chapel. Sunday, 3 o'clock. Some voices broke down immediately. Others fell into stunned silence. Most asked the same question. How? Celine kept her answers brief. He had cardiac arrest, she told them. Simple. Clean. She couldn't give them more, even if she wanted to. Eamon's family came quickly after hearing the news. His mother, her face pale and lined, clutched Celine's hands with desperate fingers. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He was fine. How could this happen so fast?" Celine forced herself to meet the woman's pleading eyes. It was sudden, she said softly. His heart. He went into cardiac arrest. She left out the tumor, left out the waiting. She couldn't bear to explain more. His father stood nearby, silent, his jaw tight as he tried to hold himself together. More relatives arrived, cousins, old family friends. Then people from Eamon's shop. Ryvan, his best buddy, was shocked, too. Some shook her hand with stiff politeness. Others embraced her briefly, murmuring condolences. They all asked the same things. Why? How? And Celine kept giving them the same simple answers. But then, as Celine stood near the entryway, watching another cluster of guests walk in, she saw him. A man dressed entirely in black. His shirt was crisp, buttoned neatly at the collar, and his coat hung perfectly from his broad shoulders. His dark hair was slicked back, and his gray eyes found hers with precision, steady, calm, and unflinching. He walked toward her with a measured, deliberate pace, as if he belonged there, as if this wasn't strange at all. Celine's breath hitched the moment she saw him. She froze for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening around the small clutch in her hand. When he stopped in front of her, his gaze never left hers. He bowed his head slightly, his voice smooth but low, almost intimate. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. Celine's throat dried. She stared at him, her eyes hard, questioning, searching his face as if she wasn't sure whether to be furious or afraid. "What are you doing here?" she asked under her breath, her tone sharper than she intended. There was no welcome in her voice, just a simmering undercurrent of something unsaid. He didn't flinch. Instead, he studied her for a brief moment, then said softly, "I miss you." The words landed heavily between them. Her stomach twisted at their weight, her heartbeat pounding painfully in her chest. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered back, glancing quickly around them, her composure brittle. But no one was paying them attention. The mourners were too absorbed in their own grief, their own small circles of conversation. "I had to come," he murmured, leaning in ever so slightly, his voice like a breath against her ear. "You weren't answering your phone." He straightened, his gray eyes darker now. "And I told you, I'll be here for you, no matter what." Celine's jaw tightened as she fought back the wave of emotions rising inside her. Grief, guilt, something dangerously close to longing. "This isn't the time," she managed, her voice strained. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something softer in his gaze. "I know," he said quietly, "but you're not alone." The words almost undid her. She pressed her lips together, her nails digging into her palm as she nodded faintly. "We'll talk later," she said, barely audible. He inclined his head once in agreement, then took a step back, melting into the crowd as seamlessly as he had appeared. But she could still feel his presence, even as he moved away, and the weight of everything she'd kept hidden pressed heavier against her chest. Celine drew in a shaky breath and turned back toward the chapel doors, where Eamon's casket rested at the front of the room. She stood still for a long moment before walking toward her seat, her face calm and composed, but inside her world was. After 2 days of funeral reception, as the funeral service ended with a cold wind brushing over the gathered mourners at Valemont Memorial Gardens, the skies overcast but holding back the rain. As Eamon's casket was lowered into the earth, Celine stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, every muscle in her body tense. Eamon's mother, Isolde Varelli, stood beside her husband, gripping his arm tightly, her other hand clutching a white handkerchief that she had soaked through with silent tears. Eamon's 2 siblings, his younger sister Lucienne and younger brother Theron, hovered nearby, keeping close to their grieving mother. After the burial, Celine quietly offered for family and close friends to gather at the apartment she had shared with Eamon for refreshments. She had arranged for a small catering service earlier that day. Trays of finger foods, tea, coffee, and wine had been laid out in the open-plan kitchen and dining area. The space was clean and impersonal, everything neatly arranged, just as Eamon had always preferred. People gathered in muted conversations, voices low as they shared memories of Eamon, some tearing up, others holding back emotion as best they could. Celine moved among them mechanically, offering small smiles, polite acknowledgments, and brief hugs. She was exhausted, but her expression didn't betray much. At least not yet. Isolde, however, couldn't stay seated. She sat stiffly on the sofa, a teacup untouched in her lap, her eyes distant as if she were searching for something just out of reach. Finally, she set the cup down with shaking hands and rose slowly to her feet. Celine noticed immediately. "Mom," Celine asked softly, crossing the room toward her mother-in-law. "Do you need anything?" Isolde turned, her eyes glassy but sharp. There was something there, something tight in her expression. I want to see Eamon's things," Isolde said, her voice strained but steady. "Just for a moment. I want to touch his clothes, his books, before I leave. I need to say goodbye." Celine hesitated for the briefest second, but then she nodded. "Of course," she said gently, masking the hesitation. "Come with me." She led Isolde down the hall to the bedroom she and Eamon had shared for 7 years. The door was half open, the room still as orderly as it had been when Eamon was alive. His side of the bed was neatly made, his books stacked on his nightstand, his watch still resting in the small dish where he always left it. It smelled faintly of his cologne, though Celine had packed away some of his things earlier. Not everything. Not yet. Isolde stepped inside slowly, as if afraid the room might vanish. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the dresser before settling on the wooden frame that held a photo of Eamon and Celine from years ago. "You kept this," Isolde murmured almost to herself. Celine said nothing. For a few long minutes, Isolde moved quietly around the room, touching his books, opening the closet to run her hand over his hanging clothes, letting her fingertips brush over the sleeves of his jackets. She lingered at his desk, where old notebooks were stacked. Her fingers traced one, and then slowly, she opened it. Her brow furrowed slightly as she flipped through a few pages. Her mouth tightened, and Celine noticed the way her shoulders stiffened. "Mom?" Celine asked, her voice low but cautious. Isolde quickly closed the notebook and set it back down. She took a breath, her face smoothing into a neutral expression, but Celine could see something flicker behind her eyes. "I'm finished," Isolde said quietly. Celine nodded, stepping back to give her space to leave. When they returned to the living room, Isolde's pallor had gone even paler. She pressed her hand against her chest briefly, an unreadable expression settling over her face. She barely touched her husband's arm before saying, "Cashin, I don't feel well. We should go." Cashin Varelli, Eamon's father, turned toward her immediately. A tall, reserved man with silver streaking through his dark hair. He nodded, concern flashing across his otherwise stoic features. "Of course," Cashin said. "Lucienne Theron, let's get your mother home." Lucienne glanced at her mother in concern. Theron gave Celine a faint nod before moving to help his father gather their coats. Celine stood nearby, watching quietly, but her stomach tightened. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way Isolde wouldn't look directly at her now, in the way her hand had trembled ever so slightly as she reached for Cashin's. "I'll check on you tomorrow," Celine offered, forcing a polite smile. Isolde paused. She looked at Celine then, just for a moment, and there was something heavy and hard in her gaze. Not grief, not entirely. "Thank you, Celine," Isolde said softly, but there was a sharpness in her tone, hidden under the courtesy. As they left the apartment, Celine stood by the door, her expression still calm, but her mind was already racing. Isolde had found something, but what, and how long before someone else came asking questions? The ride back to the Varelli estate was long and muted, the passing scenery blurred by the overcast sky and the gloom that seemed to hang inside the car. Isolde sat quietly in the back seat, her hands tightly gripping the folded handkerchief on her lap. She wasn't wiping her tears anymore. She simply let them fall, streaking silently down her pale cheeks. Cashin kept glancing at her from the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. Lucienne sat beside her mother, casting worried glances but not daring to speak. Theron, in the front passenger seat, stared blankly out the window, arms crossed, as if bracing himself for something. When Cashin finally parked the car in front of their home, he didn't wait for the engine to cool before turning to look at Isolde directly. "Isolde," he said gently but firmly. "What is it? What's weighing on you?" She said nothing until they were inside. They all moved to the living room. No lights were on yet, but the house was familiar enough that none were needed. They settled into their usual places. Cashin in his leather chair, Lucien near the corner of the sofa, Theron standing, unable to sit still. Isolde remained standing for a long moment near the mantel, resting one trembling hand against it before she spoke. Her voice cracked when she finally did. "In Eamon's room, while Celine stood nearby, I found something." The room quieted even more, the stillness almost suffocating. Cashin's brows drew together as he leaned forward slightly. "What did you find?" he asked carefully. Isolde drew in a shuddering breath, her hand going to her chest, clutching the pendant she always wore. "It was in one of his notebooks. A photograph," she whispered, eyes clouded with fresh tears. "I didn't understand at first, but then I saw it clearly." She turned toward them, her expression dark with both grief and something colder. It was Celine, in bed with another man. Cashin stiffened, his back going ramrod straight. Lucien let out a sharp, disbelieving breath, her eyes going wide. Theron's expression twisted into something dark and tight, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You're certain?" Cashin asked slowly, though his tone was grave. Isolde nodded. There was no mistake. It was her. And it wasn't Eamon beside her. Her voice broke, but she steadied herself. They were both unclothed. It wasn't some innocent photograph. The room sank into heavy silence. The rain had finally started outside, tapping faintly against the tall windows, the only sound in the heavy air of the room. Lucien covered her mouth, looking away as if ashamed of something she couldn't name. Theron finally spoke, his voice like stone. "He knew," he said. "Eamon knew, and he didn't say anything." His throat worked hard, and he shook his head bitterly. And he still loved her. Isolde sat down now, her hands trembling violently. I think he kept it to himself. I think he died keeping that pain locked away." Cashin's face was carved from granite, unreadable and distant, but there was a glimmer of anguish in his eyes. "I suspected there was distance between them," he said slowly. "But Eamon never spoke a word of it to me." "No," Isolde whispered. "He wouldn't have. He was trying to protect her. He always did." They sat in silence, the weight of that revelation pressing on them like a second funeral. Cashin broke it, his voice low. Celine betrayed him, and still stood over his grave. Lucien finally looked at her father. "What are we going to do?" Cashin didn't answer immediately. He stood, moving to the liquor cabinet and pouring himself a measure of dark scotch. "For now, nothing," he said, his voice steeled with quiet authority. "But we'll watch. We'll wait. The truth always has a way of coming out." Isolde sat back on the couch, her face pale but set with grim determination. "I want to know who that man was," she said quietly. "I want to know what part he played in this." Theron nodded. "I'll find out." The family sat in their grief and anger, the storm outside intensifying, as though the house itself was mourning Eamon's death and what it had uncovered. Back at the apartment, after the last of the friends and distant relatives had quietly slipped away, Celine closed the door with a hollow thud. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on her chest like an invisible weight. The apartment, once shared with Eamon, felt too still, too hollow. She leaned against the door for a moment, taking in a long, shaky breath. But her mind wasn't quiet. Isolde's sudden departure had left a strange chill in the air. Celine couldn't shake the feeling, the way the older woman's gaze had settled on her before leaving. Not just grief, accusation. Something was wrong. And Celine knew herself well enough to trust her instincts. She wasn't just imagining it. She walked quickly toward the bedroom, her bare feet quiet against the wooden floors. The sky was gloomy and just stopped raining, the outside light casting long shadows across the room. Celine turned on the lights. She went straight for the desk. Her breath caught when she saw it. The notebook. It was right where she had left it, or so it seemed. But she noticed the thickness of it, like something was inside it. Celine is a lawyer. Details were her business. Small shifts, barely noticeable things. She saw them like they were in bold print. Her fingers hovered for a second before she slowly pulled the notebook toward her. The air felt colder suddenly, but she dismissed it. She stood at the edge of the bed and opened the cover with careful hands. At first, it was filled with Eamon's handwriting. Familiar notes, small thoughts, bits of poetry he never shared aloud. Then she turned to the next page, and the next, and then she saw it. A photograph, carefully tucked between the pages, half-creased but clear as day. Celine's blood ran cold. It was her. She was in their old bed, but not with Eamon. She was with Cyrus Halden, the same man who had shown up at the funeral, dressed in black, murmuring condolences with a soft, smooth voice. Her lover for the past 4 years. His hand had been on her lower back when no one was watching. His texts, his late-night calls. He was the one who had pulled her away from Eamon again and again. Celine's hand trembled violently as she traced the edge of the photograph, her breath shallow and ragged. All this time, Eamon had known. She didn't know for how long, or how much he had seen. But this picture was proof that he knew more than she'd ever imagined. And he hadn't confronted her. He hadn't said a word. No accusations. No bitter fights. He just carried it. The weight of it crushed her. Her vision blurred. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor with a dull thud, her knees scraping against the hardwood. The notebook fell on the floor and more pictures came out. She sat there, hunched over, the photos clutched in her hand as the tears spilled down her face. She pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to break free. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the darkened room. "I'm so sorry, Eamon." The wind picked up suddenly outside, rattling the window panes. But inside the room, it was more than just the breeze. The temperature dropped sharply. The small pendant wind chime near the door shuddered faintly, ringing softly in the still air. Celine froze, her breath catching in her throat. And then she felt it, the presence, heavy, sad, and close. She turned her head, her body stiff, but there was no one there. Not that she could see, but he was there. Eamon, standing near the window, his figure faint, pale as a wisp of smoke. His eyes, however, were clear, soft, sad. He was watching her, not with anger, not with hate, but with the deep, quiet sorrow of a man who had loved and lost everything. He had watched her at the funeral. He saw everything, even Cyrus attending his wake. He had watched her stand by his grave. He had heard her hollow apologies whisper at his body. And now, here she was again, breaking in the place they had called home. Celine's breath came in ragged gasps. "Eamon," she choked out, tears blurring her vision. I didn't think." Her voice cracked. She couldn't finish the sentence. What was she going to say? That it wasn't real? That Cyrus meant nothing? No, she couldn't lie anymore. Not now. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. Her fingers loosened on the photos, letting it fall onto the floor beside her. Eamon stood there, unmoving, his expression almost peaceful. But his eyes carried a depth of sorrow she couldn't bear. And then, slowly, the faint figure began to fade. Celine reached out with a shaky hand, desperate. "Wait, please, don't go." But he was already gone. The room was empty again, silent, and Celine was left on the cold floor, alone, with the ghost of what they once had, and the proof of what she had destroyed. As Eamon's spirit dissolved from the apartment, leaving Celine to her grief and regret, he drifted through the dimming skies. There was no sensation of time or distance, only the pull of something familiar, something that still tethered him. He found himself standing before his childhood home, the Varelli estate, timeless in its solemn beauty. The house stood silent under the gray clouds, the windows reflecting the fading light like dark eyes that had seen too much. Eamon stepped forward, his translucent form passing easily through the front door, as if it had always welcomed him, even in death. Inside, the faint warmth of the home wrapped around him like a memory, the familiar creak of floorboards beneath invisible feet, the faint scent of old books, polished wood, and his mother's faint floral perfume. He heard her voice first. Isolde. His mother. She sat on the old velvet couch in the sitting room, her back straight despite the heaviness in her chest. Her fingers clutched the old rotary phone, pale knuckles standing out against the dark green receiver. Lucien and Cashin beside her. Celine's voice crackled faintly from the other end of the line. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to be this way. But Isolde cut her off, her voice ice-cold but composed. There is nothing left to say, Celine. Pause on the line. I just wanted to. I want Eamon's things sent back to this house. All of them, Isolde said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Clothes, books, even the smallest things. You will have nothing left of him. And in return, we will have nothing to do with you. Celine must have gone quiet, because Isolde's voice became even sharper, as if cutting away the last fragile thread. Our family is severing ties with you. I don't care if you marry another man after Eamon's death. I will not have your shadow darkening his memory any longer. Silence. Then the faint click as Isolde hung up. Eamon's spirit stood a few feet away, watching his mother with a bittersweet ache. He had never seen her so composed yet so deeply wounded. Her hands trembled as she replaced the phone on its cradle. For a long moment, she simply sat there, staring at the floor, her shoulders heaving once in a silent sob she refused to let free. Lucien puts her hand on her mother's shoulder while Cashin is just silent. Eamon moved closer, instinct guiding him. He reached out his hand, pale and faint like mist, hovering over hers. Though his fingers never touched, the faintest glimmer of warmth passed through the space between them. Isolde stilled, blinking through sudden tears as if she had felt something. Some small comfort in the cold emptiness. She pressed her free hand to her heart. My boy, she whispered softly. Eamon wanted to say something, but his voice was carried away like breath on wind. He lingered for one last moment, memorizing her face, as well as his sister and father. The love is still alive in them despite everything. And then he let go. He whispered a farewell they could not hear, though a faint warmth remained in the air around them. The world around Eamon dimmed. A light, so bright it was blinding, filled his sight. When he opened his eyes again, it was to the sharp contrast of shadows and sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds. The ceiling above him was familiar, the texture of the old plaster, the faint crack near the light fixture. He blinked, confused. His body felt strange. He sat up slowly, his fingers gripping cool, cotton sheets. They felt real, solid. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood shakily, every movement met with a disorienting sense of weight and life. His bare feet touched hardwood floors. He crossed to the old dresser that sat in the corner, his heart pounding in his chest, not with sickness or stress, but alive with something else. Hope, terror. He stared into the mirror above the dresser. The reflection that met him was not the face he had known in the last days of his life. It was younger, his 19-year-old self, staring back at him with wide, clear eyes, his jaw more defined, his hair thicker, his skin free of the faint lines life had etched into it over the years. His breath caught in his throat. This can't be real, he whispered. But when he lifted his hand, the reflection followed. When he pinched the skin on his forearm, he felt the sharp sting of it. Real. Alive. He took a shaky step back, glancing around the room. Posters from his university days were still on the walls. His old textbooks, unopened for years, stacked neatly on the desk. His guitar, untouched since graduation, leaned against the far wall, the strap tangled just like he had left it. He crossed to the window and threw open the curtains. Outside, students walked by on campus paths, backpacks slung over their shoulders, the autumn leaves swirling in the crisp breeze. It was his university. It was the past. But he was here. Eamon's mind raced. Had he died and been granted some kind of second chance? Was this a dream? He pressed a hand to his chest where the tumor had once been. There was nothing there. His heart pounded steady and strong beneath his ribs. And for the first time in years, he was alive. Chapter 3. Eamon stood frozen for a long moment, his mind reeling with possibilities. Is this really the past? Am I reliving it? Or is this a chance to do it all over again? The weight of uncertainty pressed against his chest, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating burden of illness. It was the raw ache of something unfamiliar, hope. Then there was a soft knock at the door. A familiar knock. "Brother!" came the bright, young voice of his sister. "Breakfast is ready. Mom says if you don't come down in 5 minutes, she'll eat your share." He blinked, startled, and crossed the room. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before he opened it. There she was, Luchan, his little sister, younger by a decade, full of life and energy. Her dark hair was tied in a messy ponytail, and she wore her school uniform haphazardly with untied shoelaces. Her brown eyes, wide and bright, looked up at him with impatience. "You okay?" she asked, squinting at him. "You look like you saw a ghost." Eamon could hardly believe it. She was just 11 years before life would pull them in different directions. His chest ached, but it was different now. Full. "Luchan," he said quietly, testing her name on his tongue as if it were a memory he didn't want to lose. "Yeah. I need you to do something." Her brow scrunched. "What?" "Kick me." She blinked, then grinned. "For real?" "Yes," he insisted, almost desperate. "Hard. Just do it." Luchan shrugged, clearly thinking her brother had finally lost his mind. But she drew her foot back and gave him a sharp kick to the shin. "Ah! Ow!" Eamon stumbled back, clutching his leg as the pain shot through him. Luchan laughed, half in mischief, half in disbelief. "You asked for it." But Eamon didn't care. The sting in his leg told him everything he needed to know. This was real, or at least real enough. Before she could bolt down the hall, he grabbed her in an embrace, pulling her close. "Hey!" she squawked, squirming. "What's with you?" But Eamon held on a little longer, breathing in the moment. She smelled of soap and childhood. "You're my favorite little sister," he whispered. "I'm your only little sister," she retorted, rolling her eyes. But she grinned as she wriggled free and dashed down the stairs. "Hurry up, or Mom's gonna eat everything." Eamon stood there for another heartbeat, then followed more slowly, each step grounding him in the moment. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw the kitchen bathed in morning light. The table was cluttered with plates of steaming eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. The smell of brewed coffee mingled with the faint hint of flowers from a vase on the counter. And there they were, his parents. Cashin, his father, in his usual pressed shirt, reading the paper while sipping coffee. His dark hair was streaked with early gray even then, his sharp features softened by the quiet of morning. And Isolde, his mother, busy at the stove. Her hair was pinned up messily, wisps falling around her face as she hummed quietly to herself. She plated pancakes with a skill born from years of repetition, her movements graceful, warm. Eamon stood there for a second, absorbing the sight. This family that once seemed distant at times now glowed in his eyes. He walked over slowly and, before he could change his mind, wrapped his arms around his mother from behind. Isolde stiffened in surprise, nearly dropping the spatula. "Eamon?" she said, half laughing, half worried. "What's gotten into you?" But he just hugged her tighter. "Nothing. Just missed you." She chuckled softly, patting his arm. "Well, I'm right here, silly." When he finally let go, he turned to his father. Cashin glanced over the rim of his glasses, brow raised. "Is it your birthday and I forgot?" he asked dryly. As Eamon stepped back from hugging his mother, He turned toward his father, who was still seated at the table, quietly watching him over the rim of his coffee cup. Cashin's dark brows were drawn together, a flicker of curiosity in his sharp gray eyes. Without hesitation, Eamon crossed the room and wrapped his arms around him in a firm, heartfelt hug. Cashin stiffened instantly, like a man caught off guard in a storm. He was not one for sudden displays of affection, and Eamon could feel his father's body tense beneath his grip. After a brief pause, Cashin gave him one solid tap on the back, a gesture of affection disguised as formality. "All right, son," Cashin said, his voice rumbling low. "What's going on? Is it your birthday and I forgot? Or did you crash the car and need me to fix it before your mother finds out?" Before Eamon could answer, a pair of footsteps thudded down the hallway behind them. Theron, Eamon's younger brother, entered the room carrying a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, dressed in his school uniform and half-tied sneakers. At 16, Theron was already taller than Eamon remembered him being, his lean frame filling out as he approached his second year of high school. His dark hair was a bit messy, and his backpack was weighed down with books. He froze mid-stride at the sight before him, his older brother clinging to their father like it was the end of the world. "What they?" Theron muttered, his brows shooting up in suspicion. Eamon's heart swelled. Theron, alive, healthy, smirking like always. Without thinking, Eamon stepped away from his father and crossed the room, pulling his younger brother into a tight, sudden hug. "Whoa, hey, what is happening right now?" Theron said, stiff at first before awkwardly patting Eamon on the shoulder like he was dealing with a malfunctioning machine. "Is this a new thing you're doing? Are you crying?" Eamon shook his head, holding his brother even tighter for a moment. "Just missed you, that's all," he said quietly. Theron finally pulled back a little and squinted at him. "You're acting seriously weird. You're not on anything, are you?" He glanced at their dad. "Dad, is he on something illegal?" Cashin exhaled through his nose, setting his coffee cup down with a faint clink. "That's exactly what I was about to ask." Then Lucienne piped up from the doorway, where she was munching on a piece of toast and watching the entire scene with interest. "He's not on anything," she said, her mouth half full. "He told me to kick him earlier. I did it, and then he hugged me like I just saved his life." Theron gave her a sidelong glance. "And you did it? Just kicked him? Like, no hesitation?" Lucienne shrugged. "He asked. It was weird." Cashin leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, his sharp gaze flicking between his children. "Eamon, this sudden burst of affection, and asking your sister to assault you, should we be worried?" Isolde, their mother, narrowed her eyes as she returned to the table, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're not in trouble, are you? We don't need police showing up on our doorstep." Eamon laughed softly, the sound surprising even himself. It had been so long since he'd heard his own laugh sound so alive. "No, I'm not in trouble. I just—" He paused, looking at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces. "I just realized how lucky I am to have all of you." His mother raised a skeptical brow. "You've been lucky your whole life, but I appreciate the sentiment." Then she exchanged a knowing look with Cashin. "He's hiding something." Theron grinned. "Yup, I'm betting on secret girlfriend. Or secret baby." Lucienne rolled her eyes. "He doesn't even have a job. How would he take care of a baby?" They all started tossing playful guesses around the room, and Eamon sat back, letting the sounds of their laughter and teasing wash over him like a warm tide. The way they were now, close, lively, unburdened, was something he had long thought lost. And here it was again, right in front of him. He smiled to himself. I have another chance. And this time he wasn't going to waste it. As the breakfast slowly wound down, Lucienne grabbed her bag and bounded out the door with the energy only a 12-year-old could have, calling a quick goodbye to everyone before the door slammed behind her. Theron slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and gave Eamon a lingering, wary look before muttering, "You're still weird," and heading off to catch his ride to school. Eamon chuckled under his breath as he watched them go, the house settling into a familiar stillness that he hadn't heard in years. He could almost pretend it was any normal day. But it wasn't. He carried the dishes to the sink automatically, still half dazed by the fact that his hands were steady, young again, free of the weight he remembered carrying later in life. His mother, Isolde, was quietly wiping the counters down when she turned toward him, studying his face with those sharp green eyes of hers, the ones he'd always thought missed nothing. "Eamon," she said softly, "come with me for a second." She didn't wait for him to answer, just walked toward his room, expecting him to follow. He did, closing the door behind them as she sat on the edge of his neatly made bed. The room was almost exactly as he remembered it. Posters on the wall, books stacked unevenly on his desk, a faded scarf draped over his chair. Time hadn't yet stripped away the small comforts. Isolde's hands rested on her lap as she glanced up at him. "Are you really okay?" she asked gently. "You've been different this morning. Not in a bad way," she added quickly, "but different enough for me to notice. You hugged your father, Eamon, and Theron, and Lucien." She smiled faintly. "You never did that before. Not all at once." Eamon sat down beside her slowly. His heart beat faster as he realized this was a moment he'd taken for granted years ago. His mother's concern, her attention. Back then, he'd probably shrugged her off, too consumed by his own life to really appreciate her presence. He took a breath. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, careful to keep his voice steady, warm. "Honestly, I just woke up today feeling grateful, I guess. I realized I've been growing up too fast and not paying attention to the things that matter. Like hugging my family before it's too late." His throat tightened at his own words, but he smiled anyway. "I'm not in trouble. I'm not hiding anything." Isolde studied him for another long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she reached out and smoothed his hair back like she used to when he was a boy. "All right," she said quietly, "but if something's wrong, you tell us. No matter what." "I will," he promised, and this time he meant it. A faint warmth passed between them, something healing. After a few more quiet moments, she stood and gave him a brief nod before heading out to finish her day. Eamon stood there for a long while, breathing in the comfort of his old room. Then he shook himself out of his thoughts. "If I'm back, I need to make the most of this." He changed into his university uniform, black slacks, a crisp white button-down, and the same navy tie he used to hate wearing. But after he entered his third year, he no longer needed to wear it. Somehow, today it felt like putting on armor. He checked his reflection in the mirror again. His 19-year-old self staring back at him, the lines of stress and regret gone from his face. He grabbed his bag, stuffing it with a few notebooks and pens, and took one last look around. On his way out, he passed his father, who was still seated at the table with a newspaper. Cashin glanced up over the rim of his glasses. "You're off early," he remarked. Eamon smiled faintly. "I've got some things I need to catch up on," he replied. Cashin nodded in approval, though there was still curiosity in his eyes. "Don't forget dinner." "I won't," Eamon said. He stepped out into the bright morning, the air crisp and fresh. It had been so long since he'd seen this neighborhood alive with kids riding bikes, the smell of bread from the corner bakery wafting through the air. Even the uneven sidewalks felt like home. As he walked toward the bus stop, he ran through his plans. He had lectures today, sure, but he also had to remember who he knew and when, the mistakes he'd made, the people he had trusted, and those he hadn't. The university campus was a 15-minute ride away. As the bus pulled up, Eamon slipped inside, finding a seat near the back. He stared out the window as the scenery passed by, his mind racing. He wasn't just here to relive his life. This was his second chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. The lecture hall buzzed with familiar noise, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, the low thud of textbooks being dropped on tables. Eamon found a seat near the middle, not too close to the front, not too far back. As he settled in, he ran his fingers over the surface of his notebook, the texture grounding him in this surreal reality. Mechanical engineering, he thought with a quiet smile. It had always been his dream. Back then, he was too caught up in deadlines, assignments, and trying to survive to really appreciate the weight of learning. This time, he was going to build something that lasted. Not just watches, works of art, heirlooms people would treasure. Maybe even jewelry. His mind flickered with sketches and blueprints he hadn't drawn yet but already envisioned. The instructor arrived, and the room slowly quieted as the lecture began. Eamon took notes diligently, but his mind kept drifting to his old life. The years spent perfecting tiny gears, the satisfaction of hearing the first tick of a movement he'd built from scratch. He remembered his tiny shop, the pride he felt when a customer smiled after buying their first watch. He could have had more if he'd started earlier. This time he would. When the class finally ended, Eamon gathered his things, his heart thrumming with a quiet purpose. He made his way out into the sunlight, scanning the crowd of students pouring out of the nearby halls. His pulse quickened as his eyes landed on a familiar figure standing near the benches by the university quad. Tall, lean, with his signature messy hair that no amount of combing could fix, wearing a faded gray hoodie over his uniform jacket, and a bag slung carelessly over one shoulder. It was him, Riven. The name left Eamon's mouth before he even realized it. The man turned, blinking in surprise, and then his expression lit up in the same easy, reckless grin Eamon remembered so well. Eamon! Riven strode over, his gait casual but purposeful. Without hesitation, he tapped a hand on Eamon's shoulder, squeezing hard. Man, you look like you've just seen a ghost. Eamon chuckled under his breath. If only you knew. Something like that. They stood there for a moment, taking each other in. Riven hadn't changed a bit. His friend had always been his anchor, the one person who stuck by him through everything in his first life. Even when Eamon's marriage to Celine started to crumble, Riven had never judged, never left. He was the one who'd helped him set up his workshop years later, putting in sweat equity even when he didn't have to. You've been quiet lately, Riven said, eyeing him. Everything okay at home? You didn't message me all week. Eamon shook his head, then smiled. It's good. Really good, actually. But I've been thinking about something big. Riven raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What kind of big are we talking? A road trip? Dropping out and becoming monks in the mountains? Because I'm telling you now, I'm not shaving my head. Eamon barked a laugh, the sound feeling lighter than it had in years. No, bigger. A business. Watches. And eventually jewelry. High-end stuff. Custom pieces, hand-built movements. Things people can pass down through generations. Riven stared at him for a beat. Then, slowly, a grin stretched across his face. Now that sounds like something you'd come up with. Eamon leaned in a little, his voice dropping. I'm serious, Reeve. I'm starting now. Early. I've got the designs in my head. And I want you with me. Riven tilted his head. Me? You believed in me before anyone else, Eamon said. I know you'll keep me grounded. We'll split the profits down the line, 50-50. You handle logistics, orders, networking. You're good at talking to people. He paused, then added, and I'm good at building. For a moment, Riven just stared at him. Then he let out a low whistle. You've really thought this through. In a way, Eamon said quietly. This is something I have to do. There was a pause. Then Riven stuck his hand out. You're insane. But I'm in. Eamon took his hand and shook it firmly. We're going to make history. They stood there in the quad, shaking hands like two old friends making a pact. In a way they were. But this time, Eamon wasn't going to wait until it was too late. As they left campus together, tossing ideas back and forth, Eamon felt a rare kind of hope stirring in his chest. This was his chance to rebuild. His career, his family's future, even himself. Eamon arrived home around 7:30 in the evening, the sky outside already cloaked in deep indigo, with a thin sliver of moon hanging low above the rooftops. The house was warmly lit, a familiar glow spilling out through the windows. For the first time in years, or what felt like years, he felt eager to step inside, knowing what waited for him wasn't cold silence but the comforting din of family. Inside, The smell of home-cooked food greeted him. Roasted chicken, garlic rice, and his mom's signature vegetable soup. The one she always said was good for clearing the head and warming the soul. He found them gathered around the dining table. Isolde setting down a dish, Lucien busy fiddling with her drink straw, and Theron scrolling through his phone but quickly putting it away when their mother shot him a look. His dad sitting beside Theron. "Eamon's home," Lucien chirped, noticing him first. She grinned as if it had been days rather than hours since they last saw each other. Cashin gave a small nod, his usual reserved greeting, but Eamon could tell he was glad he was back. Isolde smiled as well, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "You're later than usual," she said as she handed him a plate. "Everything okay?" Eamon washed his hands after setting his bag down. He took his seat. "Yeah, better than okay, actually." They all sat, the quiet clatter of cutlery filling the first few minutes of the meal. But after a few bites, Eamon cleared his throat. "I was talking with Riven today," he began casually, but the way his family immediately gave him their full attention made him realize how important his words might sound. "And I've decided I'm going to start a business." Isolde tilted her head, pausing mid-sip of her soup. "A business?" she repeated slowly. "What kind?" Eamon smiled, his fingers tracing his glass unconsciously. "Watchmaking. Custom, handcrafted watches. Eventually, I want to expand into jewelry too. I think there's a real future in it." Lucien gasped softly. "Like the watches you used to tinker with in your room?" He nodded. "Exactly. I want to make something lasting, not just as a hobby, but as a career. And I'm starting now, while I have the time and the energy." Theron leaned back in his chair, eyeing Eamon with curiosity. "And Riven's in on this with you?" "Yeah," Eamon said. "He's gonna handle the logistics, suppliers, marketing, things like that. He's a natural with people, and I trust him." Theron was quiet for a few seconds longer than Eamon expected. Then he said, "That actually sounds pretty solid." Isolde exhaled softly, visibly relieved at Theron's response. "It's a big responsibility, Eamon," she said carefully, though there was pride in her tone. "Running your own business isn't easy." "I know," Eamon replied, holding her gaze. "That's why I'm planning everything properly this time." His dad just glanced at him and continued eating. He set his fork down, looking across the table toward Theron, who was still watching him with that thoughtful expression. "And I was thinking," Eamon said slowly, "if you're interested, I'd like you to join us too." Theron blinked. "Me?" "Yeah," Eamon said. "You've always had a head for numbers. You're sharp and you're organized. I could use someone like you to handle finances, at least until we're big enough to hire someone else." For a long moment, Theron was silent. He glanced at their dad, who was watching quietly, then back to Eamon. "You want me to manage the money?" "I trust you," Eamon said simply. "And this isn't just about me and Riven. I want this to be something for all of us, our family. You, Lucien, Mom, Dad. I want to build something that lasts, and I can't do it alone." Lucien beamed, clearly excited by the idea, and even Isolde's normally cautious demeanor softened into something warmer. Theron gave a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You're acting weird lately," he muttered, though there was no malice in it. "But, yeah, I'll think about it." Eamon smiled. "That's all I'm asking." By the end of dinner, the mood had lightened considerably. Even Isolde seemed more at ease as she poured them all glasses of her homemade iced tea. As they gathered in the living room afterward, Theron actually brought out his old laptop to show Eamon some budgeting spreadsheets he'd made for a different school project. Eamon sat back, watching his family with a sense of awe. This time, he wasn't letting anything slip away. Chapter 4. The next morning dawned bright, with golden sunlight slipping through Eamon's bedroom curtains. He woke up feeling unusually refreshed, his mind clearer than it had been in what felt like years. After showering and getting dressed, he headed downstairs where the familiar clatter of dishes and soft hum of the radio greeted him. His mother, Isolde, was already setting out breakfast. Fried rice, eggs, and slices of sweet-cured pork, his favorite. "Good morning," she greeted with a small smile, glancing up from the table. "Morning, Mom," Eamon replied, sliding into his seat. He ate heartily, grateful for the simplicity of the moment. His sister Lucienne was rushing around getting her things ready for school, while Theron sat nearby sipping his coffee and scrolling on his phone. It was ordinary, familiar, and Eamon savored it. After breakfast, Eamon packed his things and made his way to university. His classes weren't heavy this semester. It was still his second year, so he had time to breathe before the chaos of senior year. He planned to use that time wisely. Later that day, Eamon met with Ryvan at their usual hangout spot near the engineering building, a small open courtyard lined with benches and shaded by old trees. Ryvan was lounging comfortably on one of them, his sketchpad open as he scribbled out logo ideas for their watch brand. "I'm thinking of something minimal," Ryvan said without looking up. "Something that can be stamped on the dial but still stands out." Eamon chuckled. "You're way ahead of me." Ryvan smirked. "Of course, I take this stuff seriously." They talked for a while about materials, suppliers, and possible names for their brand. It was exciting to brainstorm this early. Knowing the mistakes he made in his previous life, Eamon felt better prepared this time. He wouldn't waste these years. But then, their conversation was interrupted. "Yo!" a familiar voice called out. Eamon looked up to see another friend striding toward them. It was Calden, an old classmate who was always the life of the party. He had that same cocky grin plastered across his face, his backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. "I've been looking for you too," Calden said as he came closer. "Guess what? There's a mixer this Saturday night. Some girls from St. Celestine's are joining, and we need more guys. You both are coming, right?" Ryvan lit up immediately. "Seriously? Hell yeah, I'm in." Calden slapped him on the shoulder. "Knew I could count on you." But Eamon stood there, his mind suddenly clouding. Mixer. Saturday night. St. Celestine's. He remembered now. That was the night. The party where he first met Celine. She was radiant back then, her laughter clear and bright as crystal. They hit it off immediately, or so he thought. Back then, he believed it was fate. But it wasn't. Not really. Fate had twisted in cruel ways after that night, and he had no intention of repeating it. "I don't think I can make it," Eamon said, his voice steady. "I'm busy this weekend. Got something going on." Calden raised an eyebrow. "Busy? On a weekend?" "Yeah," Eamon replied, "working on something important with Ryvan." He glanced at his friend for backup. Ryvan blinked, then caught on. "Right, yeah. Business planning and stuff." Calden looked disappointed but shrugged. "Fine. Your loss. I'll message you the details anyway, in case you change your mind." With that, Calden gave them a wave and wandered off, whistling some pop tune as he went. Eamon exhaled slowly and sat back down on the bench. Ryvan gave him a curious look. "You sure you want to skip that?" Ryvan asked, raising an eyebrow. "There'll be a lot of pretty girls there." Eamon gave a faint smile but shook his head. "I've got enough on my plate right now." What he didn't say was, "I don't want to meet her. Not this time. I'm cutting the thread before it tangles me again." He had a second chance now, and he wasn't going to waste it chasing someone who had shattered him once before. Eamon and Ryvan spent the rest of the afternoon at their usual hideout, a small, old-fashioned coffee shop tucked in between a bookstore and an antique store. It was cozy, with warm amber lights and dark wooden furniture. The owner, an elderly woman named Nanette, greeted them with a nod as they took their seats in the back corner, a spot they'd unofficially claimed over the years. Ryvan nursed his usual cold brew while Eamon stuck with black coffee, his notebook already open, filled with his fine-line sketches. Watch dials with intricate designs, some classic and minimal, others daring and experimental. He even jotted down the inner mechanisms, gears and springs that would come together with precision. Ideas flowed easily now that he had lived through the mistakes and triumphs of his past life. Ryvan watched him in awe. "You've been different lately," he said, spinning his pen between his fingers. "Focused, driven." Eamon gave him a faint smile. "I just don't want to waste time anymore." They brainstormed until the coffee shop dimmed its lights for closing. Riven scribbled down some of Eamon's suggestions, and they agreed to research suppliers first thing Monday. The plan was falling into place faster than Eamon had dared to hope. The days slipped by quickly. By Friday night, Eamon found himself lost in his work. His desk at home was cluttered with sketches, diagrams, and a list he'd titled Key People and Opportunities. Names were carefully written in neat columns, clients who had invested in his work before, partners he knew he could trust. He even noted major business opportunities that had risen in his old timeline, moments he was determined to take advantage of this time around. He had also listed red flags, people to avoid, deals that had sounded good on paper but led to disaster. One name stood out, underlined 3 times. Celine Alderis. He stared at it for a moment, then drew a line through it. No going back. Saturday came, the day of the mixer. Eamon's phone buzzed sometime in the late afternoon. A message from Calden. Don't flake, man. 8 p.m. at Luce's rooftop. You're missing out. Eamon glanced at the time. It was nearly 6. He sighed, slid the phone aside, and turned back to his notes. He had an important timeline to organize. There was no space in this life for distractions. As the evening wore on, he sat at his desk, pencil scratching against paper as he refined a design for a skeleton watch. A model that, in his previous life, had brought him recognition. He planned to launch it earlier this time. It was delicate work, and he found a strange comfort in the mechanical precision. Unlike people, gears didn't lie. The following day, Eamon met up with Riven at the coffee shop again. Riven was 15 minutes late, looking slightly disheveled but buzzing with energy. He slumped into the chair across from Eamon with a grin on his face. "Man, you really missed out last night," Riven said, running a hand through his messy hair. Eamon took a sip of his coffee, raising a brow. "Oh," Riven laughed. "Yeah, it was packed. The girls from St. Celestine's showed up, and they were not playing around." Eamon gave a faint smile, but his attention was half on his notebook. Riven continued, clearly enjoying himself. "I met this girl, Tess. She's studying architecture. Smart, funny. And her smile, man. You'd think it was straight out of a toothpaste commercial." "Sounds like you had fun," Eamon replied genuinely. "I did. We're meeting up again next week," Riven said, eyes bright. "But seriously, I thought you were going to bail on me forever. Everyone was asking where you were." "Yeah," Eamon replied, closing his notebook. "I needed to focus." Riven gave him a long, measuring look. "You're serious about this business?" "I am," Eamon said. "We get this right and we won't need mixers to meet anyone. They'll be coming to us." Riven chuckled but nodded, his excitement catching again. "You're right. Let's make it happen." As they clinked their coffee mugs together, Eamon allowed himself a brief, quiet moment of satisfaction. He was steering his life into a different future. And this time he wouldn't lose control. Eamon and Riven threw themselves into their plans over the following weeks. They spent afternoons poring over their sketches and concepts, and evenings scouting potential locations for their shop. It had to be the right balance, affordable, accessible, and with enough foot traffic to draw interest. After visiting nearly a dozen places, they finally found it. The shop was located on a lively street just off the central plaza, where local businesses thrived. The building was old. Its red brick facade cracked in places, but it had charm. Large display windows framed the front, perfect for showcasing their designs. The street outside bustled with people during the day. Students, office workers, and families alike. Eamon could already envision a sign above the door with their name on it. Lucent and Company. A name he had thought of, meaning clarity and light. It fit what they wanted to create. As he stood there on the cracked pavement, he could feel it in his gut. This was the place. But there was a problem: funds. Eamon had some savings, but it wouldn't be enough to cover the lease, initial renovation, and equipment. In his previous life, he had scraped by, stubbornly refusing to ask anyone for help. This time, he made a different choice. That night, after dinner, he sat with his father, Cashin, in the small living room. The TV played quietly in the background, but neither of them was watching. Isolde was busy in the kitchen, and Lucienne was finishing homework at the table. Theron had just come back from basketball practice and was upstairs showering. "Dad?" Eamon started, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jeans. "Can I talk to you about something serious?" Cashin muted the TV and gave him his full attention. "Of course." Eamon explained everything. The plan to start a watch and jewelry shop with Riven, the potential he saw in the location, and how much they needed to get started. He promised to pay it all back. In fact, he was so serious about it, he laid out a repayment plan in a notebook, complete with projections. Cashin listened without interrupting. When Eamon was done, his father leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "You've really thought this through," Cashin said finally. "I have," Eamon said. "I want you to know what I'm doing this time. I want to make you proud, Dad." Cashin gave him a look Eamon hadn't seen in years. One of quiet pride, mingled with something like regret. "You already do. And you're not borrowing the money," he said. "It's an investment. If you're serious about this, and I can see you are, then I'm backing you. As your father. As a partner." Eamon's chest swelled. His throat felt tight. In his past life, he hadn't given his parents this chance. Now he was glad he did. "Thank you, Dad," Eamon said quietly, fighting the sting behind his eyes. "I won't let you down." "You won't," Cashin said, giving his shoulder a solid squeeze. "We believe in you." Later that night, Isolde brought out an old ledger of Cashin's from when they were first starting their small family business. She gave it to Eamon, telling him it might help. Even Lucienne offered to help decorate the store when they opened. And then there was Theron. One evening, as Eamon was sketching ideas for the interior of the shop, Theron flopped onto his bed unannounced. "You need muscle?" Theron asked casually. "Because I'm free after practice." Eamon chuckled. "I think we can find you something more productive." Theron sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been thinking, maybe I could learn from you guys, like how things are made, the watches and stuff." "You sure?" Eamon asked, studying his brother. Theron shrugged. "Better than wasting time. And I think it's cool. What you're doing." That was all Eamon needed to hear. He smiled. "Then you're in." So their team grew. Eamon, Riven, and now Theron. They made trips to the shop together, cleaning out dust and grime, repainting the walls. They hired an electrician to fix the outdated wiring, but most of the manual labor they did themselves. Some nights they were exhausted, but it was the kind of tired that came from building something together. The official opening was still a while off, but Eamon already felt like he was living a life he could be proud of. A life full of choices he wouldn't regret. And this time, with his family standing behind him, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Chapter 5. As the repairs on the shop got underway, Eamon wasted no time in setting up his personal workspace in a small corner of the back room. The place was still dusty and smelled of old paint, but he didn't care. This was where it would all begin. He unpacked his tools with care, some borrowed from his father's collection, others newly purchased with the investment money Cashin had provided. Precision screwdrivers, tweezers, loops, and tiny oiling needles were neatly arranged on a simple wooden workbench they'd salvaged from the storage room. It wasn't much yet, but Eamon's fingers itched to get back to the familiar, meticulous rhythm of watchmaking. At 19, he was already decades ahead of his peers, thanks to his previous life's experience. His hands moved confidently as he began crafting his first pieces for their soon-to-open shop. He chose classic designs at first, simple, elegant wrist watches with leather bands, focusing on high quality and clean craftsmanship. Every watch bore his personal touch, a tiny engraving on the inside of the case. Lucent time. It was subtle, something only a watchmaker or a curious owner might notice, but it felt right. It marked the beginning of something he planned to last a lifetime. When he wasn't assembling watches, he was sketching out new designs for accessories, bracelets, straps, watch cases, while Riven handled sourcing quality materials. They decided to keep their starting inventory manageable but distinctive. 10 original watches and a selection of accessories. They also opened up for repair services, A smart move Eamon knew from experience would help keep the business afloat in the early days. Riven proved himself to be more than capable. He managed supplier negotiations like a pro, striking deals with leather workers for premium straps and negotiating with small manufacturers for high-grade steel parts. They even partnered with a local artisan who crafted wooden boxes to house their watches. Each box hand-carved and finished with a natural oil that gave it a warm sheen. Riven was tireless, and his belief in their venture was infectious. "You sure you're only 19? Riven joked one night as they both sat on overturned crates, eating takeout after hours of polishing display cases. Eamon grinned. "Born old, maybe." By the second week, Eamon began contacting names from the list he'd compiled. Individuals he remembered from his previous life who had either helped or hindered his old business. This time, he planned to make smarter choices. He met with Alvin Perez, a man who would later become a successful distributor in luxury timepieces. Alvin was still young, running his father's modest shop on the other side of town, but Eamon recognized his potential. He proposed a collaboration. They could cross-promote each other's products and share supplier contacts. Alvin was skeptical at first but agreed to a trial run after seeing Eamon's work firsthand. "You've got talent," Alvin said, inspecting one of the watches, "and ambition. I'll give you a shot." Eamon also reached out to Mira JL, a freelance photographer he remembered as someone whose product photography turned small brands into sought-after names. He commissioned her to take promotional shots of their watches and the store itself. Her photographs were stunning, capturing the detail and craftsmanship of each piece, and Eamon knew they'd elevate their marketing. Meanwhile, Theron took to the repair work surprisingly well. Eamon taught him how to handle basic repairs, battery changes, strap adjustments, and polishing. Within days, Theron was confidently interacting with early customers who stopped by out of curiosity while they prepped the shop. "Didn't know this was my thing," Theron admitted one evening after successfully fixing an old pocket watch for a man from the neighborhood. "But this is kinda cool." Eamon smiled. "You're a fast learner." Bit by bit, the shop began to take shape. The cracked bricks on the outside were cleaned and restored. The windows sparkled. Inside, the walls were painted a warm cream, and the display shelves Riven built by hand gave the space a rustic yet polished feel. They kept things minimal but intentional, with each watch and accessory displayed as if it were a treasure. By the time they hung the Lucent and Company sign above the door, Eamon stood back and took a deep breath. This was no longer just an idea on paper. It was real. And this time, he had his family's support, his brother and best friend beside him, and a future he was determined to shape with his own two hands. Sunday arrived, and with it came the soft opening of Lucent and Company. Eamon stood at the entrance early that morning, adjusting his cufflinks as he watched the sunlight pour over the newly painted sign. He glanced over his shoulder at Riven and Theron, who were busy making last-minute adjustments inside the shop. The glass display cases gleamed, showcasing their small but elegant collection of handcrafted watches and accessories. Each piece was carefully positioned under soft lighting to bring out its finest details. By mid-morning, the first guests began to trickle in. Neighbors from the nearby shops, a few classmates curious about their venture, and old family friends who had watched Eamon and his siblings grow up. Some came with genuine smiles and warm congratulations, tapping Eamon on the back and praising the craftsmanship of the watches. But not everyone had kind words. Eamon noticed a few cold stares from certain shopkeepers down the street. They walked in with polite but forced expressions, their eyes scanning the place with an air of judgment. He could see it in their looks. They were skeptical, maybe even envious. Small-town minds didn't always welcome change, and seeing young men like Eamon and Riven start a business stirred a few quiet rivalries. Riven caught Eamon's eye as one such pair walked out without saying a word. "They'll come around," Riven muttered, nudging him with a reassuring grin. "Especially when they see how much money we're making." Eamon chuckled, though he stayed cautious. Success bred attention, both good and bad. Business was steady. Not overwhelming, but manageable, which was exactly what they wanted for the first day. A handful of watches sold, mostly to supportive family friends and neighbors, and a couple of repair requests were scheduled for the following week. Eamon made mental notes of everything. The flow of customers, which displays attracted the most attention, and which products sparked genuine interest. By mid-afternoon, they started talking about hiring someone. They'd need a reliable clerk on standby, especially since school would soon demand more of their time. Riven agreed and said he had a cousin who might be interested. Someone friendly? Eamon reminded him. We want people to feel welcome here. The soft opening wound down by sunset. They closed the shop feeling satisfied but knowing they had a long road ahead. Back in his small workroom that evening, Eamon cleaned his tools with care and turned his attention to his next batch of designs. He had to keep up production, knowing their inventory would need refreshing soon. Alongside his usual watch sketches, he started outlining jewelry designs, something he hadn't seriously considered in his past life until much later. Delicate rings, minimalistic bracelets, and simple necklaces. Pieces that could complement their watches or stand alone as unique works. Better start early, he thought, his pencil gliding smoothly across the sketchpad. But as he immersed himself in his work, life outside the shop continued. And despite his efforts to avoid certain entanglements, fate had a way of looping old threads back into his life. Celine. Even though he carefully planned his routes around campus and town to avoid her, he caught sight of her now and then. It was always from a distance. A glimpse of her familiar profile walking across the university quad, or her laughter floating over a crowd when she was surrounded by friends. Sometimes he'd round a corner and see her standing there, chatting with people he no longer shared any connection with. He never made eye contact. He never spoke. Each time he saw her figure in the distance, he changed his course, sometimes ducking into side streets or buildings until he was sure she was gone. And yet, despite the occasional pang in his chest, he felt at peace. There was no anger in him anymore, just a clarity he hadn't known before. He owed her nothing. She had no place in this new life he was building. One afternoon, as he passed by the main courtyard, he heard her name mentioned by a group of students nearby. Celine was apparently making waves already. People were talking about her joining student organizations, about her charm and ambition. It was exactly how it had been before. But this time, Eamon felt nothing but distant observation. Hey! Riven nudged him, bringing him back to the moment. You spaced out. Eamon shook his head, refocusing. Just thinking about the next design. They walked on, side by side, away from the past. As time moved forward, Lucent and Company steadily gained momentum. What started as a humble watch repair and accessory shop was now drawing in more customers than Eamon had initially hoped for. Word-of-mouth recommendations spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the steady stream of visitors turned into a daily rhythm. Their meticulous craftsmanship, fair prices, and honest service became their strongest advertisements. By the third month, they had more orders than they could comfortably handle. Riven, with his talent for customer relations, kept clients happy at the front while Eamon spent long hours bent over his workstation in the back, assembling watch faces, polishing metal parts, and perfecting each timepiece by hand. Theron, who had joined them as an unofficial apprentice, proved to have an eye for detail. He handled repairs and smaller commissions, quickly earning Eamon's trust. At the same time, their partnership with Alvin Perez was already proving successful. Alvin, who managed one of his father's companies and had experience running retail businesses, had contributed several product designs and ideas that appealed to a broader market. Some of Alvin's exclusive pieces, sleek, minimalist watches, were already on display in Lucent and Company's front glass cases. Much to Eamon's satisfaction, they were selling well. Alvin's got an eye for trends, Riven remarked one afternoon as they restocked the display case. Those pieces are flying out of here. Eamon agreed, giving a small nod. We made the right call partnering with him. And once we launch the jewelry line, we'll have an even wider range of customers. But as their business grew, Eamon realized they were falling behind on one important front: branding and visual design. Their logo was basic, and their promotional materials weren't as polished as he wanted, especially if they were going to expand their online presence. We need a graphic designer, Eamon said one evening as they reviewed their marketing plans with Alvin during a video call. Someone who can give us a consistent look for the website, social media, And even our packaging. Ryvan tapped his chin thoughtfully. Actually, I might know someone. There's a guy in the IT department who freelances as a designer. He did some graphics for one of our school events, and they turned out pretty solid. What's his name? Eamon asked. Kalen Cruz, Ryvan replied. He's got the skills and he's fast. I can reach out and see if he's free to work with us. Do it, Eamon said without hesitation. The sooner, the better. He knows Kalen, a very talented person, and would soon gain more attention as time goes by. Within a few days, Ryvan arranged a meeting with Kalen at their shop. Kalen arrived carrying his sketchpad and tablet, his easygoing demeanor making a good first impression. After reviewing Lucent and Company's products and existing branding, Kalen presented several concepts that impressed everyone. Clean lines, a modern yet timeless aesthetic, and attention to the little details. Kalen seemed to understand the essence of their brand immediately. By the end of the week, they had finalized their new logo and started work on updated packaging and advertising materials. With Kalen handling the visuals, Alvin managing the business side, and Ryvan keeping the front end smooth, Eamon finally felt their team was coming together perfectly. Their success wasn't just luck. It was built on hard work, trusted partnerships, and lessons Eamon had learned the hard way in his previous life. Now, with only a month left before the end of his second-year term, Eamon looked forward to dedicating his break to crafting his jewelry collection, something he dreamed about but never fully accomplished before. The future was looking bright, and this time, Eamon wasn't going to let anything slip away. That night, Eamon had gone to bed feeling more at peace than he had in both of his lives. The soft hum of the ceiling fan, the gentle laughter of his siblings earlier that evening, and the warmth of a family dinner still lingered in his mind as he drifted off. He had everything he once thought he'd lost: a thriving business, a united family, and a future he was carving out with his own hands. For the first time in a long time, he truly felt like himself again. But then, amid the stillness of his deep sleep, something stirred. A faint, persistent voice echoed in the darkness of his mind, cutting through the peaceful haze like a shard of ice. Wake up! It was gentle but firm, a voice that sounded close yet far at the same time. Wake up, Eamon. His breathing quickened as if something heavy pressed against his chest. Slowly, his eyelids fluttered open, but instead of the familiar ceiling of his childhood bedroom, he was met with a blinding brightness, a strange space that stretched endlessly. The warmth of his bed, the quiet hum of life around him, all of it was gone. Where am I? Eamon whispered, his voice hollow in the vast space. He glanced around, but there were no walls, no floors, no sky, just an infinite expanse of light. The air itself was still, and yet he felt a pressure on his skin, as if something or someone was watching him. Then, a soft, glowing form coalesced before him. It wasn't human, but he could sense its presence. It pulsed faintly like a living star, its voice calm and resonant. Now that you are awake, Eamon, the voice spoke. How do you feel? Eamon's throat tightened. His instincts told him something was wrong. He slowly lifted his hand and pinched his forearm hard. Pain shot through him, sharp and clear. He winced. You can still feel pain, the voice remarked. That's a natural reaction. Even without your body, remnants of sensation remain. Eamon's heart pounded. His thoughts tangled together. What do you mean without my body? He managed to ask, his voice shaky. You are dead, the voice said plainly. You died, Eamon. The words hung in the air like cold iron. Eamon staggered back a step, but there was no ground beneath his feet. He didn't fall, he simply floated there in disbelief. No, that's not possible, Eamon said breathlessly. I was alive. I was back in college. I had my shop. I was with my family. You can think of it as a dream, the voice interrupted gently, or as the last desire of your soul given form. After you died in the hospital, after you said goodbye to your family, your spirit lingered. There was so much you wished you had done differently. And so, you created a world and memory of your past. A world where you could live again, free of pain, free of regret. A chance to mend what you lost. Eamon's chest felt tight. But it was real, he argued. I felt it. I laughed with my sister. I hugged my mom. I worked. I sweated. I cried. It was real. It felt real, the voice acknowledged, because your longing made it real within the realm of your soul. Every moment was shaped by your will, and so it became your truth. Eamon's mind spun as he tried to comprehend it. He had believed, with his entire being, that he'd been given a second chance, that he'd gone back in time. But it was never the past. It was only a reflection. So, I was never alive again, Eamon murmured. His voice cracked with the weight of the truth. No, the voice said softly. Your body ceased, and your spirit clung to the memories of who you were and who you wished you had been. You created your own solace. Eamon stood silently in the brightness, his heart breaking all over again. All that effort, all the hope, and it was never going to last. He wasn't returning to his family. He wasn't rebuilding his life. What happens now? He asked quietly. You have fulfilled your final wish, the voice answered. It's time to let go, to move forward. A deep silence followed, yet Eamon slowly exhaled. Though the pain was sharp, there was something strangely comforting about knowing that the peace he felt wasn't false. It had been his peace. His heart had found rest, even if it was only for a little while. I understand, he said finally, closing his eyes. And as he did, the bright light surrounding him shifted, becoming warmer, as if it was welcoming him home. Chapter 6. As the brilliant light swirled around him, growing warmer and softer, Eamon felt an unfamiliar sense of calm wash over him. The voice, gentle yet resonant, continued to speak, its tone steady and kind. You don't need to worry, it assured him. You will live again, but not as Eamon, not in the world you knew. Eamon remained still, listening intently. There was no resistance in his heart. He had already said goodbye, twice, to his old life, to his regrets, and to the peace he found in the life he recreated for himself. Now he was ready for whatever came next. Your soul, the voice went on, will be purified before you are reborn, washed clean of past memories, free from the burdens you once carried. This is necessary for your next journey to truly begin. You will have no recollection of this life or the one before it. What you built, what you loved, what you lost, all of it will rest in the past, where it belongs. Eamon exhaled slowly, his heart steady. I understand, he murmured. It's probably for the best. He wasn't afraid. In fact, there was a strange sense of hope blooming within him. The chance for something new, untainted by pain or guilt. Even if he wouldn't remember, it was a chance to live again, perhaps to live better. Your next life will be yours to shape, the voice continued. The identity you take, the path you walk, it will be yours to create. There is no guarantee of fortune or happiness, but your soul carries the potential for greatness if you choose to embrace it. Eamon nodded, accepting the truth. A new identity, a new world, unknown possibilities awaited him. The light thickened around his form now, gentle tendrils wrapping around him like silk threads. He could feel his essence loosening from all that he had once been. The memories that had defined him began to drift away, slowly dissolving into a warmth that felt like sleep after a long, long journey. And as they slipped from his grasp, Eamon whispered to himself, "Thank you." Not to the voice, not to anyone else, but to his own heart. For enduring, for hoping. The voice spoke one last time, fading as the light grew impossibly bright. Go, and live well. The light enveloped him fully, and Eamon's consciousness faded. When the light receded, a new cry broke through the air. A newborn child, swaddled in soft cloth, let out his first breath in a world unknown. His small hands clenched in the air, his chest heaving, alive. The midwife smiled softly, handing the child to a woman lying on a bed, who took him in trembling arms, tears in her eyes. It's a boy, the midwife said warmly. Strong lungs on this one. The woman looked down at the baby. Welcome, my little Aaron, she whispered. Aaron, no longer Aemon. His soul had been reborn, clean and new, in a world that was not the one he had left behind. Outside the small home, strange birds sang in a sky streaked with violet clouds. Towering mountains loomed in the distance, and faint traces of magic shimmered in the air. This was a different world entirely, one where people whispered about mages and guilds, of kingdoms and ancient powers. And in this world, young Aaron would grow. He would have no memory of watches or regrets, no lingering ache for lost love. But deep within him, the strength of the soul that had once been Aemon would remain, quiet but ready. And when he was old enough and the time was right, that strength would awaken. His new story was only just beginning. Epilogue. After Aemon's death, the days dragged on in a haze for Celine. But on the fourth day, the Varelli family arrived at the apartment she had once shared with her husband. It was a gray morning when Isolde stepped through the door first, with Cassian right behind her. Theron and Lucien were carrying boxes, their faces cold and unreadable. They said very little when Celine opened the door for them, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands trembling. They moved with quiet precision. Every item that belonged to Aemon, his clothes, his books, his sketches, his watch collection, was carefully packed away. Even his coffee mug on the kitchen counter, the one he always used, was taken. His toolbox, his favorite pens, the journals he used to write in, all gone in moments. They left nothing of his personal life behind. Celine followed Isolde into the bedroom, tears streaking her face as she spoke in a weak, desperate voice. "Please, don't take everything. Please, just leave me something. Anything." Isolde, holding one of Aemon's old watches in her hand, turned toward her. Her face was pale but firm, her grief channeled into cold resolve. "For what, Celine?" she said quietly but sharply. "For you to have another keepsake of the man whose heart you shattered? You don't deserve anything that reminds you of him." Celine flinched at the words, her breath hitching. "I loved him," she whispered hoarsely. I made a mistake, but Isolde cut her off, her jaw tight. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice that broke my son. Aemon trusted you. He loved you when he shouldn't have. And you?" Her voice cracked, but she straightened herself, swallowing down the wave of emotion. "You led him to his death." Cassian rested a hand on his wife's shoulder then, a silent gesture of support, but he didn't say anything. Theron and Lucien stood quietly by the door, their faces a mirror of hurt and disgust. Lucien's eyes were glossy, but her stare was hard as glass. Celine dropped to her knees, clutching at Isolde's hand, but Isolde pulled away as if burned. "We're taking Aemon's things," she said, her voice final. "And this is the last time we will speak." As they left the apartment with box after box, Celine collapsed on the floor of the emptying living room, her sobs echoing in the space that had once been full of warmth. They left behind only a few things. Gifts she had given Aemon, some trinkets that clearly held no sentimental value to them anymore. But the emptiness in the apartment was suffocating. It wasn't long after that the rumors began to spread. Aemon's friends, once warm and kind to Celine, distanced themselves from her. Some openly expressed their disappointment. Others said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. She was no longer welcome in places where she had once been greeted with open arms. The whispers seeped into her workplace too. At first, the managing partners tried to act as though nothing had happened, but eventually, she was called into a private meeting. "Celine," one of them began, his tone formal but not unkind, "we believe it's best that you take a leave of absence, for yourself and for the firm." She didn't argue. She couldn't. The look on their faces was clear. It wasn't just for her sake. It was for the sake of the firm's reputation. She packed up her things that same day, leaving the office with a hollow ache in her chest. Stories followed her. That Aemon had died because of her infidelity. That the betrayal had broken him. Some added more cruel lies, stories she knew weren't true, but she had no strength to defend herself anymore. Then one night, her phone buzzed unexpectedly. It was Riven. For a moment, hope flickered in her chest. She answered quickly, but before she could speak, His voice came through, sharp and cold. "You destroyed him," Riven said. "You destroyed one of the best men I've ever known." "Riven," she choked, but he kept going. "He never said a word about it to me, never complained. He just carried that pain alone. And you let him." His voice cracked with anger. "I hope you're happy." Before she could reply, the line went dead. When she tried to call him back, she found herself blocked. The world grew quieter after that. Lonelier. Celine sat in the empty apartment night after night, the silence pressing in like a weight on her chest. She still had her work as a lawyer, but now it felt distant, detached. She found herself staring at the old framed photo on the shelf, one of her and Eamon during their early years together. Smiling, happy, but the image no longer brought her comfort. And somewhere, deep inside, she knew she had burned the bridges that could never be rebuilt. In the quiet of her now empty apartment, Celine sat alone on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, staring blankly at the wedding photo of her and Eamon that still hung on the wall. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her thoughts heavy, tangled in regret and confusion. She ran her fingers over the glass frame, tracing Eamon's smiling face. Where did it all go wrong? She asked herself for what felt like the 1000th time. Their life together had been warm once, full of shared dreams, laughter. They had talked late into the night about starting a family, about the little house they wanted to build near the coast, where their children could run barefoot on the grass. Eamon had always been patient with her, gentle in his love. She had felt safe with him, but something had shifted. And as she sat there, staring at the pieces of her life falling apart, Celine followed the thread back to the night when things truly started to change. It was 4 years ago. She had been promoted at work. Her team had just finished a successful case, and they went out to celebrate. It was a fancy after-party at a high-end bar downtown. One of those places with dim lights, smooth jazz playing in the background, and glasses of wine that never seemed to empty. Eamon had told her to enjoy herself, as he always did, supportive and trusting. And then he was there, Cyrus Halden, a name that still made her stomach twist in ways she couldn't explain. He was standing by the bar, drink in hand, dressed sharply in a dark suit that fit him a little too well. His dark eyes had flickered toward her the moment she walked in. He was striking, with an easy smile that seemed to see right through her. People surrounded him, but his attention was fixed on her as if she were the only one in the room. Celine hadn't meant to talk to him. She told herself it was harmless, just a casual conversation. But as the night wore on, they talked about everything: her career, his family's import business, literature, music. He was clever, charming in a way that was dangerous. There was a current beneath his words, a pull she couldn't deny. She felt seen in a different way. Eamon had always been steady, a grounding force. Cyrus was a storm. He was reckless and exciting, a fire she never thought she craved until it was already too late. Celine sighed heavily, burying her face in her hands. After that night, she found herself seeking Cyrus out more often. First at events, then casual coffee meets, then stolen dinners. And the more time she spent with Cyrus, the more distant she became from Eamon. She remembered how Eamon had tried, how he noticed the change. He came home early more often, cooked her favorite meals, asked her about her day with genuine warmth in his eyes. But she had pulled away. She told herself it was work stress. She told herself she was just tired. The truth was, she was already slipping away, entangled in something she couldn't, or wouldn't, stop. And Cyrus knew it. He made her feel wanted in a way that confused her. He whispered things in the dark that made her feel alive, even if the thrill came laced with guilt. At first, she told herself it would pass, that it was just a fleeting thing. But 4 years passed in that tangled mess, and by the time she realized what she was doing, it was already too deep. She cheated on Eamon, not once but countless times. And each time she came home and looked at him, his gentle eyes, his unwavering patience, it killed her a little more. But she convinced herself he didn't know, that she was sparing him by not confessing. But he did know. He always knew, and he never said a word. And now he was gone. Celine's chest heaved with sobs she couldn't contain. She had ruined everything. And now even Cyrus was gone. He had disappeared after he attended Eamon's funeral, as if he'd only been there for the thrill of it all. He never answered her calls, never replied to her messages. She was left alone in the wreckage she had created. And no one was coming to save her. The apartment, once filled with laughter and warmth, was cold and silent. Every photo, every empty drawer where Eamon's things once were, screamed at her of what she had lost. Not just a husband, but a home, a life. Where did it all go wrong? She whispered to herself again. But deep down she already knew. The next day, as a pale morning light filtered through the half-closed curtains of Celine's apartment, there was a hesitant knock on the door. Celine, still drained and hollow-eyed from another sleepless night, dragged herself off the couch to answer. When she opened it, standing there was one of her closest friends, someone she hadn't expected to see so soon. "Viandra," Celine murmured, her voice scratchy and tired. Viandra Inez, her friend since law school, stepped inside quietly. She was still as poised and polished as always, shoulders squared beneath a tailored coat, dark hair swept back neatly, but there was a wariness in her eyes, as though she was unsure whether to offer comfort or confrontation. Probably both. Celine tried to hold herself together, but the sight of someone familiar, someone from before, nearly broke her. She stepped aside, wordless, and Viandra entered. The apartment was a mess of half-packed boxes and empty spaces where Eamon's things had once been. A mug of cold tea sat untouched on the coffee table. Viandra took in the scene with a glance, then quietly walked over to the couch, sitting down with an audible sigh. Celine followed, sitting stiffly on the opposite end, her hands clenching in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Viandra finally said, her voice steady but edged with something sharp. "But I was worried." Celine's throat closed up as tears welled in her eyes. "You shouldn't have," she whispered. "I don't deserve that." "No," Viandra agreed bluntly. "You don't." That made Celine flinch, but Viandra's expression softened, just slightly. "I'm not here to excuse what you did," she went on. "None of us are. You hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Eamon," she paused, swallowing thickly. "He was a good man. You broke him, Celine." Celine nodded, her vision blurring. "I know." Viandra sighed again and leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands clasped loosely. "I'm here because I think you need to understand something, and maybe, if you're ever given the chance again, you won't do this to someone else." Celine wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "What do you mean?" she asked hoarsely. Viandra's gaze was steady now, almost cold. "Cyrus." At the sound of his name, Celine stiffened. Her pulse spiked in her throat. "What about him?" Viandra exhaled, as though bracing herself. "I did some digging after the funeral, and then some people who don't normally talk, started whispering to me." She straightened up, her tone grim. "Cyrus Halden isn't who you thought he was. He never was." Celine shook her head slowly, unable to take it in. "What are you saying?" Viandra gave her a look, one Celine had seen before when Viandra cross-examined a lying witness. "He was planted, Celine. Hired. Paid off." Celine stared at her, heart hammering against her ribs. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." It is," Viandra cut in. "He was hired by one of your rivals. Someone you humiliated in court 4 years ago. Remember Loring Tan's case? The businessman whose company you helped dismantle after the embezzlement charges." Celine's stomach twisted painfully. "Of course, but Loring has powerful friends," Viandra continued, "and they don't forget easily. Cyrus was sent to get close to you. They didn't care how. Charm you, seduce you, ruin you. They wanted revenge. They didn't expect Eamon's death. That wasn't part of the plan." Celine stared at her friend in horror, shaking her head. "No," she breathed. "Cyrus, he cared about me." Viandra's jaw tightened. "Did he?" she asked coldly. Because after Amon's death, Cyrus vanished. No goodbye. No explanation. Nothing. He was gone, Celine. He did his job. You were ruined. Mission accomplished. Celine felt as if she couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth, shaking with sobs. I destroyed everything. I didn't even know. Viandra stood, pacing a short line in front of the coffee table. You want to know what I don't understand? She asked sharply. If you were so unhappy, why didn't you leave Amon? Why stay married to him if you felt nothing? Why keep hurting him every single day? Celine's tears came faster now, her voice breaking as she tried to answer. I thought I could fix it, she whispered. That maybe it was just a phase. That I'd come back to him. Viandra's eyes softened, but only a little. You didn't fix anything, Celine. You only made it worse. Silence hung heavy between them. You need to live with this, Viandra said quietly. Own it, and if you're ever given another chance, don't do it again. Celine nodded faintly, her throat tight. I won't, she managed. Viandra sighed and crossed her arms. You're lucky you're not in prison. If Amon's family wanted to push it, they could. The firm won't protect you forever. Celine sat there in numb silence as Viandra picked up her purse and walked to the door. Before she left, she looked back once. Goodbye, Celine. The door clicked shut, leaving Celine alone with her guilt and the cold memory of her mistakes. Back in the Varelli house, the air was thick with sorrow and memories that clung to every corner. They had returned home just hours ago, after carefully packing Amon's personal belongings from the apartment where he spent the last years of his life. His car, still clean and meticulously maintained, now sat parked in the driveway like a ghost of the life he once had. They had moved his things inside with care and reverence, each box silently reminding them of the gentleman they had lost. Inside the living room, cardboard boxes were stacked neatly, and the family sat quietly, sorting through Amon's possessions. Isolde, who had always been composed and gentle in her way, cradled one box in her lap as if it were something fragile. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Lucien sat nearby, folding Amon's neatly pressed shirts and stacking them with precision, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Theron was silent in the corner, sifting through Amon's collection of books, his jaw clenched tightly. Then Isolde found it. Tucked beneath a bundle of letters and photographs was a worn, leather-bound diary. Amon's familiar handwriting on the cover simply read personal journal. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened the diary, flipping carefully to the first page. As she read, her lips quivered. Today I became the happiest man in the world. Celine said yes to forever. I can't believe it. She looked so beautiful in her dress, and I almost thought I'd stop breathing when she smiled at me walking down the aisle. How did I get this lucky? How is it that I'm holding the hand of someone who made me believe in a lifetime? Isolde shut her eyes for a moment, her heart aching. She could feel the raw, earnest love Amon had for Celine in every word. A young man, full of hope, full of dreams for a life he truly believed in. She turned the pages slowly, watching her son's happiness spill over onto every page. Sweet accounts of cooking breakfast for Celine, their movie nights, and how he would kiss her forehead while she slept. But when Isolde flipped further into the journal, the tone shifted. Somewhere in the middle, the handwriting grew heavier. The pen seemed to press harder into the page, as if Amon's emotions were weighing down his hand. Something's different, one entry read. Celine. She's been avoiding me lately. I don't know why. Did I do something wrong? I've gone over every conversation, every gesture. Did I forget something important? She says it's nothing, that she's just tired from work. Maybe she's pregnant? Maybe it's her hormones? God, I hope so. That would be amazing. A baby, our baby. That would explain it, right? Isolde's throat tightened. She could feel the ache in his words, the quiet desperation to make sense of something that didn't. She flipped ahead a few pages. She's sweet again today. She made me breakfast, called me her big bear like she used to. It makes me hopeful. I know marriage has ups and downs. Maybe we're just in a down and we'll find our way back up. Isolde let out a shaky breath. She wished, more than anything, that he had told them, any of them. She wished he hadn't carried this alone. Further along, her fingers stilled on another entry. It was dated around their 4th wedding anniversary. I saw her today, at the OBGYN clinic. I wasn't following her or anything. I was with Ryvan at the hospital. He was getting that minor surgery done, and I saw her through the glass doors. She didn't mention it to me. Why would she go to a gynecologist? Is she pregnant? She didn't say anything. Maybe it's a surprise? Maybe I shouldn't ruin it by asking. But it's been weeks, and she hasn't said a word. Should I ask? No, I should wait. She'll tell me when she's ready. Isolde closed her eyes, feeling Lucien's hand on her shoulder. But she kept turning the pages, needing to know. Then she came upon the one that made her stomach twist. 3 days later. I don't even know how to write this. Someone sent me a photo. Celine. And a man. In our bed. No clothes. Just them. And me. I'm standing here, staring at it like a fool. I keep thinking it's fake. That it's a lie. But I know that bedspread. I bought it for her birthday. I know that scar on her shoulder. It's real. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I just sat down and stared at it. How long? How long had it been going on? Was it him? The guy from her office? I can't even breathe. It's like my chest is full of glass. And if I move, it'll all cut me to pieces. Isolde's hands shook. Silent tears ran down her face as Lucien quietly slid closer and wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulders. Theron moved over, his expression grim, kneeling beside them both. And still she read. I tried asking her. She smiled like nothing was wrong. Said she loved me, kissed my cheek. But I can't. I can't feel it anymore. Her kiss. It's empty. The entries grew more fragmented after that, as though Eamon was losing the will to put his heart on the page. One of the last entries hit them hard. It was dated back last year. I went for a checkup last year. Found out there's a tumor in my chest. Benign, they said. Needs to come out eventually, they said. But I think I'll leave it. Maybe it'll grow. Maybe it'll do the thing I can't bring myself to do. Isolde sobbed openly now, her tears falling onto the pages. Theron's eyes glistened, but he held firm, his hands clenching into fists. Lucien wiped her tears silently as she gently closed the diary, smoothing her palm over the worn cover. It's not fair, Lucien whispered. He loved her so much. Theron nodded grimly. And she killed that love slowly. Isolde shook her head, as if trying to clear the weight from her chest. We should have been there, she whispered. We should have seen it. Theron's voice was rough when he spoke. Mom, we're here now. We'll honor him. We'll make sure people remember the Eamon who loved purely, who gave everything. Lucien added, and we'll make sure Celine knows what she lost. Every single day. The family sat together, the diary now resting on the table between them like a silent witness to Eamon's suffering and his love. They vowed, in the stillness of that moment, to carry his memory with dignity and protect what he had left behind. As the afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the lace curtains of the Varelli house, the family continued to carefully sort through Eamon's belongings. Each item seemed to whisper pieces of his story. His favorite books with annotations in the margins, sketches of watch designs he never got to finish, his wristwatch collection organized meticulously in small velvet-lined boxes. Every little thing spoke volumes about Eamon's quiet passion, his patience, and the life he had painstakingly built. Isolde set aside the diary with reverence, wiping away the last of her tears before reaching for another file folder tucked deep in one of Eamon's leather briefcases. The folder was thick, and unlike the others that contained work documents or old invoices, this one had a solemn weight to it. She opened it slowly, her heart heavy with dread. Inside was a stack of papers clipped neatly together. At the top was a handwritten note, Eamon's familiar handwriting both steady and resigned. My final gift for Celine. Isolde swallowed hard, feeling an icy sensation sweep through her chest. Beneath the note was a completed divorce application. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. Eamon's name and signature were there, dated precisely 3 weeks before his death. His signature was crisp, controlled, as if he had come to terms with his decision after much thought and deliberation. Lucienne leaned in to read beside her, her brows furrowing. He was ready to leave her, she murmured. He filled everything out. Theron took the papers next, flipping through them carefully. The application had everything. Grounds for divorce stated clearly. Irreconcilable differences and betrayal of marital trust. Attached behind it were carefully organized supporting documents. Photographs, screenshots of text messages, copies of hotel bookings under Celine's name, reserved for 2. It was methodical, cold in its clarity. There was another photo clipped behind the documents. This one was different from the first image they had seen in the diary entry. It was even more damning. Celine and Cyrus Halden, laughing intimately over dinner, seated in a private booth at an upscale restaurant Eamon had often taken Celine to. It was dated months before his death, long before Eamon had found the infamous photo of them in bed. He knew, Theron said quietly. He knew everything. Isolde pressed her lips tightly together, grief turning into something sharp. He gathered all this, and still he was waiting, maybe for after his surgery. Her fingers brushed the edge of the folder. Maybe he wanted to heal first. Or maybe he wanted to give her a chance to fix things. Lucienne's eyes darkened. Or maybe he just couldn't do it until he was sure he could walk away without breaking completely. There was a hospital document paperclipped to the divorce forms. Eamon had scheduled surgery for the tumor. The date was crossed out in pen with a simple note beside it. Rescheduled, need to sort personal matters first. Painted a painful picture. Eamon had wanted to live. He had been making plans, even as his heart broke. But somehow, in the days leading up to his death, something had gone wrong. Maybe the emotional toll had been too much. Maybe he had simply lost hope. I think he was going to end things, Theron said, his voice quiet but grim. He was going to get the surgery, file these papers, and start again. Lucienne sighed heavily. But Celine took all of that away from him. She left him with nothing to hold on to. Isolde closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. No, she said firmly. He didn't have nothing. He had us. And we'll carry this forward. Theron nodded. We'll make sure his story doesn't end here. Lucienne's gaze hardened. And we'll make sure Celine understands the damage she caused, whether she wants to face it or not. They all sat in silence for a moment, their grief now sharpened by the understanding of how close Eamon had come to reclaiming his life. Isolde looked down at the divorce papers again, running her fingers over Eamon's signature. This was his last act of mercy, she whispered. He called it a gift, because he still thought she deserved freedom. Even after everything, the room was heavy with that truth. Eamon, even in his heartbreak, had chosen compassion. Lucienne's eyes shone with fresh tears. He was always too kind. Isolde stood, placing the folder carefully on a shelf beside his diary. And that's how we'll remember him, not as someone broken, but as someone who chose love, even when he was betrayed. Cashin sat quietly in the corner of the living room, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable as he listened to Isolde, Lucienne, and Theron sorting through the painful remnants of Eamon's life. His dark eyes followed every word and gesture, but he said nothing. The faint ticking of an old clock on the wall was the only sound that filled the space between them as they worked. There was something calculating behind his gaze, something cold and deliberate, though he was careful to keep it hidden beneath his calm demeanor. After Lucienne and Isolde drifted off into their own quiet grief, Cashin spoke in a low, deliberate tone. Theron, my study. Theron stiffened slightly but nodded, rising from where he sat and following his father down the hall. The study door closed behind them with a heavy click. They were in there for over an hour. The murmur of their voices was faint but intense, and though Isolde tried to press her ear to the door at one point, she heard nothing distinct enough to make sense of. All she could tell was that Theron's tone became sharper, more resolute, as the conversation went on. When Theron emerged, he no longer seemed like the young man who'd been grieving alongside them. There was something different about him. His shoulders squared, his expression set with a kind of iron determination that made Isolde's chest tighten in both worry and curiosity. He walked over to where Isolde and Lucienne were sitting, his steps quiet but firm. "Mom," he said, his tone unusually gentle. "I need the folder and the diary." Isolde's brows pulled together. "Why? What are you going to do with it?" Theron gave a faint, almost reassuring smile. "It's a surprise. You don't need to worry. I'll take care of it." She hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her gaze as she exchanged a glance with Lucienne. But there was something about Theron's expression, calm, purposeful, that made her relent. She handed him the folder, fingers lingering on it for a second longer than necessary before she finally let go. Theron left without another word. Cassian remained in his study for the rest of the evening. Even when Isolde came to press him for answers, he said nothing. His silence was a wall. "It's something Theron needs to do," was all Cassian allowed himself to say before quietly shutting the door again. The night dragged on without any sign of Theron returning. Morning came and still no word. Isolde found herself pacing in the living room, her hands wringing unconsciously as worry gnawed at her. Lucienne stayed close by, but even her normally level-headed reassurance seemed forced. Cassian said nothing. He drank his morning coffee in silence, his gaze distant, watching the rain patter softly against the window. It wasn't until the following day, close to noon, that Theron finally returned. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit, one that hadn't been his before. His tie was meticulously knotted, and his hair slicked back neatly. There was a strange coldness in his eyes, a distant, controlled fury behind his polite smile. He looked as if he had stepped into a role, playing a part he had trained his whole life for but never thought he'd need. Isolde rushed to him immediately. "Where were you? What happened?" she demanded. "What did you do with the papers?" Theron shook his head. "I did what needed to be done." He gave no more than that. Meanwhile, Celine had spent the past few days in a haze, stuck between guilt and despair. The apartment, once warm and lively with Eamon's quiet presence, now felt hollow. She hadn't returned to her family's house. She had barely left the apartment at all, not even after Eamon's family took his things and Viandra came with her news. She found herself staring endlessly at old photographs, cradling keepsakes Eamon had left behind, things his family hadn't deemed necessary to take. When her phone rang one afternoon, she almost didn't answer. But when she saw the name on the screen, she felt compelled to pick up. It was Theron. Her breath caught. She hesitated before answering, half terrified of what he might say. "Theron?" she croaked. His voice on the other end was calm but chilling. "Celine. I'm so sorry," she whispered, her throat tight. "I never meant for this to happen. I'm not calling for apologies." Theron cut her off, his tone clipped. "I'm calling because we're done with you." She blinked, stunned silent. The divorce was supposed to be his final word. Theron went on. "He wanted to free you, to give you a chance to start again. But since he's no longer here to do it, we're doing something else." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, the call ended. Confused and more afraid than ever, Celine spent the rest of the day waiting for some other sign. And the next day, the news broke. Theron hadn't been able to file the divorce in Eamon's place, but he had done something that shook Celine's world completely. He had hired a legal team, a formidable one. They filed a civil suit on behalf of Eamon's estate and the Varelli family against Celine. Emotional distress, breach of trust, infliction of emotional harm that contributed to Eamon's deteriorating mental and physical health. And they had every document to back it up. The diary pages, the medical reports from the hospital, as well as the CCTV footage of that unfaithful day Celine left Eamon at the hospital, the photographs, the finalized but unfiled divorce papers, and even witness statements from people who knew about Celine's relationship with Cyrus. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a statement. Celine's reputation, already precarious after rumors about her infidelity, now faced total ruin. Word spread quickly in the legal community. No one wanted to be associated with her. Law firms that once courted her brilliance were now quietly withdrawing. Her current firm officially suspended her pending investigation and public backlash. Clients demanded she be removed from their cases. And then, there were the whispers about how she had driven her husband to despair, about how she had destroyed the man who had once adored her. Celine, after the court's decision and her admitting her fault, was guilty of the accusation. The court decided for her to be in jail for 6 months, and she wouldn't be getting any money from Eamon's assets. And since they never had a child, so there would be no support available. This decision made the Varelli family to be at peace, and Theron continued managing Eamon's shop with Riven. The end. If you liked the story, hit like and subscribe for more. Thank you. Till next time.